Chapter 1. Mrs. Whatsit. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Vorimote? No. No Vorimotes. I don't think Twitch would allow that. Behind the trees, clouds scuttled frantically across the sky. Every few moments, the moon ripped through them, creating wraith-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of the weather. It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else. On top of me. On top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong. School. School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg, I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to be can have such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." It's crazy that's a line in this book. I know, right? During lunch, she'd roughhoused a little to try to make herself feel better, and one of the girls said, scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't grammar school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home from school, walking up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under one eye. Sandy and Dennis, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than she did, were disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. A delinquent. That's what I am, she thought grimly. That's what they'll be saying next. Not mother, but them. Everybody else. I wish father... But it was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back." Gets back from where? And when? Surely her mother must know what people were saying. Must be aware of the smugly vicious gossip. Surely it must hurt her as it did Meg. But if she did not give an if it did, she gave not outward sign. That's a weird way to say that. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression. Why can't I hide it too? Meg thought. Why do I always have to show everything? The window rattled madly in the wind, and she pulled the quilt close around her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluff of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue, tucked its head under again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg. Even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who would come, so many nights, tiptoeing up the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. Hey Matthew, hey everyone, hope you all are well. Hi Shadow, welcome in. We're reading the first chapter of A Wrinkle in Time. I would hope you enjoy it then. Alright, how could they sleep? All day on the radio, there had been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in...
Thank you for the follow. Welcome to the Cult of the Snake Mom.
VTuber Senpai, thank you for the follow. How could they leave her up in the attic in the rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown right off the house, and she tossed out into the wild night sky to land who knows where? Of course. All right. Her shivering grew uncontrollable. You asked to have the attic bedrooms, she told herself savagely. Mother let you had it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment. Not during a hurricane it isn't a privilege, she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down to the foot of the bed and stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked up at her with huge, innocent eyes. "Go back to sleep," Meg said. "Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me." She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, bearing a mouthful of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse-brown hair so that it stood wildly on end, and let out a sigh almost as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices along the window frame, in spite of the protection the storm sash was supposed to offer. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened too. What was he barking at? Fortinbras never barked without reason. Oh, thank you for the hydrate, Storu. Suddenly, she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she'd heard about a tramp who was supposedly to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated on a back road as it was. And this time, maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Okay, time to listen to some stories? Yeah, welcome in, Maddie. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at the time, because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she'd heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against the ping-pong table. Now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else, she thought. Next, she walked into her old doll's house, Charles Wallace's rocking horse, the twins' electric trains. Why must everything happen to me, she demanded of a large teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs, she stood still and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room. On the right? On the left, in her parents' room. Not a rustle from her mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing again her glasses as though they could help her see better in the dark. Dennis was snoring. Denny's? I'll say Dennis was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with a succession of B's, an occasional A or a C. They were strong and fast runners, and good at games. Meow, meow. Hi, Bowser, how you doing? They were strong and fast runners, and good at games, and when cracks were made about anyone in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy and Dennis. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking seventh step. Fortinbras had stopped barking. It wasn't the tramp this time, then. Fort would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come. Suppose he has a knife. Nobody lives near enough to hear if we screamed and screamed and screamed. Eating dinner and soon gonna go to bed? Alright, not Dragon. Dragon was here earlier. Alright, Bowser, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. Thank you for popping in. Screamed and screamed and screamed. Nobody'd care anyhow. I'll make myself some cocoa, she decided. It'll cheer me up. And if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable, sitting there alone in the big, old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Dentons, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I've been waiting for you. Have a good dinner, Bowser, and sleep well?" Exactly. That is the wish of all of us. From under the table where he was lying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping for a crumb or two, Fortinbras raised his slender, dark head in a greeting to Meg, and his tail thumped against the floor. Fortinbras had arrived on their doorstep, a half-grown puppy, scrawny and abandoned, one winter night. He was, Meg's father had decided, part Llewellyn setter, and part greyhound, and he had a slender, dark beauty that was all of his own. "Why didn't you come up to the attic?" Meg asked her brother, speaking as though he was at least her own age. "I've been scared stiff." "Too windy up in that attic of yours," the little boy said. "I knew you'd be down. I put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now." How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How could he always tell? He never knew, or seemed to care, what Dennis and Sandy were thinking. It was his mother's mind and Meg's that he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people who were a little afraid of him that they had whispered about Murray's youngest child, who was rumored to be not quite bright. "I've heard that clever people often have subnormal children," Meg had once overheard. "The two boys seem to be nice, regular children, but that unattractive girl and the baby boy certainly aren't all there." It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he'd never learn to talk. And it was true that he hadn't talked at all until he was almost 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and chuckled, shaking their heads sadly. "Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg," her father had once told her. Meg remembered it very clearly because it was shortly before he went away. "There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things in his own way and in his own time." "I don't want him to grow up to be dumb like me," Meg had said. "Oh, my darling, you're not dumb," her father answered. "You're like Charles Wallace. Your development has to go at its own pace. It just doesn't happen at the usual pace." "How do you know?" Meg had demanded. "How do you know I'm not dumb? Isn't it just because you love me?" "I love you, but that's not what tells me. Mother and I've given you a number of tests, you know." Yes, that was true. Meg had realized that some of the games her parents played with her were tests of some kind, and that there had been more for her and Charles Wallace than for the twins. "IQ tests, you mean?" "Yes, some of them. Is my IQ okay?" "More than okay." "What is it?" "That I'm not going to tell you. But it assures me that both you and Charles Wallace will be able to do pretty much whatever you like when you grow up to yourselves. You just wait until Charles Wallace starts to talk. You'll see." How right he had been about that. Though he himself had left before Charles Wallace began to speak. Suddenly, with none of the usual baby preliminaries, using entire sentences. How proud he would have been. "You'd better check the milk," Charles Wallace said to Meg now, his diction clearer and cleaner than most 5-year-olds. "You know you don't like it when it gets a skin on top." "You put in more than twice enough milk." Meg peered into the saucepan. Charles Wallace nodded serenely. "I thought Mother would like some." "I might like what?" a voice said, and there was their mother, standing in the doorway. "Cocoa," said Charles Wallace. "Would you like a liverwurst and cream cheese sandwich? I'll be happy to make you one." "That would be lovely," Mrs. Murray said, "but I can make it myself if you're busy." No trouble at all. Charles Wallace slid down from his chair and trotted over to the refrigerator. His pajama feet patted as softly as a kitten's. "How about you, Meg?" he asked. "Sandwich?" "Yes, please," she said, "but not liverwurst. Do we have any tomatoes?" Charles Wallace peered over into the crisper. "One? All right if I use it on Meg, Mother." "To what better use could it be put?" Mrs. Murray smiled. "But not so loud, please, Charles. That is, unless you want the twins downstairs." "Let's be exclusive," Charles Wallace said. "That's my new word for the day. Impressive, isn't it?" "Prodigious," Mrs. Murray said. "Meg, come let me look at that bruise." Meg knelt at her mother's feet. The warmth and light of the kitchen had relaxed her so that her attic fears were gone. The cocoa steamed fragrantly in the saucepan. Geraniums. Thought there was an M in that word. An extra M. Bloomed on the windowsill, and there was a bouquet of tiny yellow chrysanthemums in the center of the table. The curtains, red with a blue and green geometrical pattern, were drawn, and seemed to reflect their cheerfulness throughout the room. The furnace purred like a great sleepy animal. The lights glowed with a steady radiance. Outside, alone in the dark, the wind still battered against the house. But the angry power that had frightened Meg while she was alone in the attic was subdued by the familiar comfort of the kitchen. Underneath Mrs. Murray's chair, Fortinbras let out a contented sigh. Mrs. Murray gently touched Meg's bruised leg. Meg looked up at her mother, half in loving admiration, half in sullen resentment. It was not an advantage to have a mother who was a scientist and a beauty as well. Mrs. Murray's flaming red hair, creamy skin, and violet eyes with long dark lashes seemed even more spectacular in comparison with Meg's outrageous plainness. Meg's hair had been passable as long as she wore it tidily in braids. When she went into high school, it was cut, and now she and her mother struggled with putting it up. And one side would always come out curly and the other straight, so that she looked even plainer than before. "You don't know the meaning of moderation, do you, my darling?" Mrs. Murray asked. "A happy medium is something I wonder if you'll ever learn. That's a nasty bruise the Henderson boy gave you. By the way, shortly after you'd gone to bed, his mother called up to complain about how badly you'd hurt him. I told her that since he's a year older and at least 25 pounds heavier than you are..." Excuse me. "And at least 25 pounds heavier than you are, I thought I was the one who ought to be doing the complaining." Oh, thank you for the hydrate store. But she seemed to think that it was all your fault. "I suppose that depends on how you look at it," Meg said. "Usually, no matter what happens, people think it's my fault, even if I have nothing to do with it at all. But I'm sorry I tried to fight him. It's just been an awful week, and I'm full of bad feelings." Mrs. Murray stroked Meg's shaggy head. "Do you know why?" "I hate being an oddball," Meg said. "It's hard on Sandy and Dennis, too. I don't know if they're really like everyone else, or if they're just able to pretend they are. I try to pretend, but it isn't any help." "You're much too straightforward to be able to pretend to be what you aren't," Mrs. Murray said. "I'm sorry, Meglet. Maybe if Father was here, he could help you. But I don't think I can do anything till you've managed to plow through some more time. Then things will be easier for you. But that isn't much help now, is it? Maybe if I weren't so repulsive looking, maybe if I were pretty like you." "Mother's not a bit pretty. She's beautiful," Charles Wallace announced, slicing liverwurst. "Therefore, I bet she was awful at your age." "How right you are," Mrs. Murray said. "Just give yourself time, Meg." "Lettuce on your sandwich, Mother?" Charles Wallace asked. "No, thanks." He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set it in front of his mother. "Yours will be just along in a minute, Meg. I think I'll talk to Mrs. Whatsit about you." "Who's Mrs. Whatsit?" Meg asked. "I think I want to be exclusive about her for a while," Charles Wallace said. "Onion salt?" "Yes, please." "What's Mrs. Whatsit stand for?" Mrs. Murray asked. "That's her name," Charles Wallace answered. "You know the old shingled house back in the woods that the kids won't go near because they say it's haunted? That's where they live." "They?" "Mrs. Whatsit and her two friends. I was out with Fortinbras a couple of days ago. You and the twins were at school, Meg. We like to walk in the woods, and suddenly he took after a squirrel, and I thought about him, and I took off after him, and we ended up by the haunted house. So I met them by accident, as you might say." "But nobody lives there," Meg said. "Mrs. Whatsit and her friends do. They're quite enjoyable." Why didn't you tell me about it before?" Mrs. Murray asked. "And you know you're not supposed to go off our property without permission, Charles." "I know," Charles said. "That's one reason I didn't tell you. I just rushed after Fortinbras without thinking, and then I decided, well, I'd better save them for an emergency anyhow." A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it, and suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows. "I don't think I like this wind," Meg said nervously. "We'll lose some shingles off the roof, that's certain," Mrs. Murray said. "But this house has stood for almost 200 years, and I think it will last a little longer, Meg. There's been many a high wind up on this hill." "But this is a hurricane," Meg wailed. The radio kept saying it was a hurricane. "It's October," Mrs. Murray told her. "Actually, it's November now. There's been storms in October before." As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fortinbras came out from under the table. He gave a long, low growl, and they could see dark fur slowly rising on his back. Meg felt her own skin prickle. "What's wrong?" she asked anxiously. Fortinbras stared at the door that opened into Mrs. Murray's laboratory. which was in the old stone dairy right off the kitchen. Beyond the lab, a pantry led outdoors, though Mrs. Murray had done her best to train the family to come into the house through the garage door or the front door and not through her lab. But it was the lab door, and not the garage door towards which Fortinbras was growling. "You didn't leave any nasty-smelling chemicals cooking over a Bunsen burner, did you, Mother?" Charles Wallace asked. Mrs. Murray stood up. "No, but I think it's best we better go see what's upsetting Fort anyhow." "It's the tramp. I'm sure it's the tramp," Meg said nervously. "What tramp?" Charles Wallace asked. "They were saying at the post office this afternoon that a tramp stole all of Mrs. Buncombe." I'm surprised it was hard to say the second time. "Stole all of Mrs. Buncombe's sheets." "We'd better sit on the pillowcases then," Mrs. Murray said lightly. "I don't think even a tramp would be out on a night like this, Meg." "But that's probably why he is out," Meg wailed, "trying to find a place not to be out." "In which case, I'll offer him the barn till morning." Mrs. Murray went briskly to the door. "I'll go with you." Meg's voice was shrill. "No, Meg, you stay with Charles and eat your sandwich." "Eat!" Meg exclaimed as Mrs. Murray went out through the lab. "How does she expect me to eat?" "Mother can take care of herself," Charles said. Physically, that is. But he sat in Father's chair at the table and his legs kicked at the rungs, and Charles Wallace, unlike most small children, had the ability to sit still. After a few moments that seemed like forever to Meg, Mrs. Murray came back in, holding the door open for... was it the tramp? It seemed small for Meg's idea of a tramp. The age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied around the head. Oh, I see a hydrate. Thank you for the hydrate, you hear? And nymph. There's your nymph, Swifter. Well, thank you for the pets. Alright, where was it? Several scarves of assorted colors were tied around the head, and a man's felt hat perched atop. A shocking pink stole...
Thank you for the follow. Welcome to the Cult of the Snake Mom.
Hunter Davos. Thank you for the follow. A shocking pink stole was knotted around a rough overcoat, and black rubber boots covered the feet. "Mrs. Whatsit," Charles said suspiciously. "What are you doing here? And at this time of night, too?" "Now don't you be worried, my honey." A voice emerged from among turned up coat, collar, stole, scarves, and hat, a voice like an unoiled gate, but somehow not unpleasant. "Mrs. What's it? Says she lost her way," Mrs. Murray said. "Would you care for some hot chocolate, Mrs. Whatsit?" "Charmed, I'm sure," Mrs. Whatsit answered, taking off the hat and the stole. "It isn't so much that I lost my way as I got blown off course. And when I realized that I was at little Charles Wallace's house, I thought I'd just come in and rest a bit before proceeding on my way." "But how did you know this was Charles Wallace's house?" Meg asked. "By the smell." Mrs. Whatsit untied a blue and green paisley scarf, a red and yellow flower print, a gold Liberty print, a red and black bandana. Under all of this, a sparse quantity of grayish hair was tied in a small but tidy knot atop her head. Her eyes were bright, her nose a round soft blob, her mouth puckering like an autumn apple. "My, but it's lovely and warm in here," she said. "Do sit down." Mrs. Murray indicated a chair. "Would you like a sandwich, Mrs. Whatsit? I've had liverwurst and cream cheese. Charles, he had a bread and jam. And Meg, lettuce and tomato." "Now let me see," Mrs. Whatsit pondered. "I'm passionately fond of Russian caviar." "You peaked!" Charles cried indignantly. "We're saving that for Mother's birthday, and you can't have any." Mrs. Whatsit gave a deep and pathetic sigh. "No," Charles said. "No, you mustn't give in to her, Mother, or I shall be very angry. How about tuna fish salad?" "All right," Mrs. Whatsit said meekly. "I'll fix it for you," Meg offered, going to the pantry for a can of tuna fish. For crying out loud, she thought. This old woman comes barging in on us in the middle of the night, and Mother takes it as though there wasn't anything peculiar about it at all. I'll bet she is the tramp. I bet she did steal those sheets. And she's certainly no one Charles Wallace ought to be friends with, especially when he won't even talk to ordinary people. I've only been in the neighborhood for a short time, Mrs. Whatsit was saying as Meg switched off the pantry light and came back into the kitchen with the tuna fish. And I didn't think I was going to like the neighbors at all until dear little Charles came over with his dog. Mrs. Whatsit, Charles Wallace demanded severely, why did you take Mrs. Buncombe's sheets? Well, I needed them, Charles dear. You must return them at once. But Charles dear, I can't. I've used them. It was very wrong of you, Charles Wallace scolded. If you needed sheets that badly, you should have asked me. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head and clucked. You can't spare any sheets. Miss Buncombe can. Meg cut up some celery and mixed it in with the tuna. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the refrigerator door and brought out a jar of little sweet pickles. Though why I'm doing it for her, I don't know, she thought as she cut them up. I don't trust her one bit. Tell your sister I'm all right, Mrs. Whatsit said to Charles. Tell her my intentions are good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Charles intoned. My, but isn't he cunning? Mrs. Whatsit beamed at him fondly. It's lucky he had someone to understand him. But I'm afraid he doesn't, Mrs. Murray said. None of us is quite up to Charles. But at least you aren't trying to squash him down, Mrs. Whatsit nodded her head vigorously. You're letting him be himself. Here's your sandwich, Meg said, bringing it to Mrs. Whatsit. Do you mind if I take off my boots before I eat? Mrs. Whatsit asked, picking up the sandwich nevertheless. Listen. She moved her feet up and down in her boots, and they could hear water squelching. My toes are ever so damp. The trouble is that these boots are a mite too tight for me, and I can never take them off by myself. I'll help you, Charles offered. Not you. You're not strong enough. I'll help. Mrs. Murray squatted at Mrs. Whatsit's feet, yanking on one slick boot. When the boot came off, it came suddenly. Mrs. Murray sat down with a thump. Mrs. Whatsit went tumbling backwards with the chair onto the floor, sandwich held high in one claw. Water poured out of the boot and ran over the floor on the big braided rug. Oh, dearie me, Mrs. Whatsit said, lying on her back in the overturned chair, her feet in the air. One in a red and white striped sock, the other still booted. Mrs. Murray got to her feet. Are you all right, Mrs. Whatsit? If you have some liniment, I'd put it on my dignity, Mrs. Whatsit said, still supine. I think it's sprayed. A little oil of cloves mixed well with garlic is rather good. Hi, Sammy. Thank you for the lurk. We are reading A Wrinkle in Time. We're still in chapter 1. Where were we? Oh, yes. A little oil of cloves mixed well with garlic is rather good. And she took a large bite of the sandwich. Do please get up, Charles said. I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far. Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity? But Mrs. Whatsit scrambled up, righted the chair, and then sat back down on the floor. The booted foot stuck out in front of her and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman. At least Meg was reasonably sure that she was an old woman, and a very old woman at that. Mrs. Whatsit, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murray, Now pull while I'm already down. Quite calmly, as though this old woman and her boots were nothing out of the ordinary, Mrs. Murray pulled until the second boot relinquished the foot. This foot was covered with a blue and gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Whatsit sat there, wriggling her toes, contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet. Ah, she said, that's ever so much better, and took both boots and shook them out over the sink. My stomach is full, and I'm warm inside and out. It's time I went home. Don't you think you'd better stay till morning? Mrs. Murray asked. Oh, thank you, dearie, but there's so much I just can't waste time sitting around and frivoling. It's much too wild of a night to travel in. Wild nights are my glory, Mrs. Whatsit said. I just got caught in a downdraft and blown off course. Well, at least till your socks are dry. Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water squishing around in my boots. Now don't worry about me, lamb. Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murray. I shall just sit down for a moment and pop on my boots, and then I'll be on my way. Speaking of ways, pet, by the way, there is such a thing as a tesseract. Mrs. Murray went very white, and with one hand reached backwards and clutched at the chair for support. Her voice trembled. What did you say? Mrs. Whatsit tugged at her second boot. I said, she grunted, shoving her foot down, that there is, shove, such a thing, shove, as a tesseract. Her foot went down into the boot, and grabbing shawls, scarves, and hat, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murray stayed very still, making no move to help the old woman. As the door opened, Fortinbras streaked in, panting, wet and shiny as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murray and whined. The door slammed. Mother, what's the matter? Meg cried. What did she say? What is it? The tesseract, Mrs. Murray whispered. What did she mean? How could she have known? End of chapter 1. Alright. Take a deep breath. Get my tongue untied. Da-da-da-da. Do a little bit of a posture check, as one does. Oh, I'm gonna hydrate a little bit, and then we'll hop into chapter 2. Alrighty. Chapter 2. Mrs. Who. When Meg woke to the jangling of her alarm clock, the wind was still blowing, but the sun was shining. The worst of the storm was over. She sat up in the bed, shaking her head to clear it. It must have been a dream. She'd been frightened by the storm and worried about the tramp, so she'd just dreamed about going down to the kitchen and seeing Mrs. Whatsit and having her mother get all frightened and upset by that word. What was it? Tess something. Hug, thank you for the hug. She dressed hurriedly, picked up her kitten, still curled up on the bed, and dumped it unceremoniously on the floor. The kitten yawned, stretched, gave a piteous meow, trotted out of the attic and down the stairs. I'm not sure why there wasn't a transitionary word there. Oh well. Meg made her bed and hurried after it. In the kitchen, her mother was making French toast and the twins were already at the table. The kitten was lapping milk out of a saucer. Where's Charles? Meg asked. Still asleep. We had rather an interrupted night, if you remember. I had hoped it was a dream, Meg said. Her mother turned over 4 slices of French toast and then in a steady voice, No, Meg, don't hope it was a dream. I don't understand it any more than you do. But one thing I've learned is that you don't have to understand things for them to be. I'm sorry I showed you I was upset. Your father and I used to joke about tesseract. What is a tesseract? Meg asked. It's a concept. Mrs. Murray handed the twins the soup. I'll try to explain it to you later. There isn't time before school. I don't see why you didn't wake us up, Dennis said. It's a jip. We missed out on all the fun. Jip, gip? I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. I hope it's correct. Anyways. You'll be a lot more awake in school today than I will. Meg took her French toast to the table. Who cares? Sandy said. If you're going to let old tramps come into the house in the middle of the night, Mother, you ought to have Den and me around to protect you. After all, Father would want us to, Dennis added. We know you have a great mind and all, Mother, Sandy said, but you don't have much sense, and certainly Meg and Charles don't. I know, we're morons. Meg was bitter. I wish you wouldn't be such a dope, Meg. Syrup, please. Sandy reached across the table. You don't have to take everything so personally. Use a happy medium, for heaven's sake. You just goof around in school and look out the window and don't pay any attention. Sounds like someone with ADHD. You just make things harder for yourself, Dennis said. And Charles Wallace is going to have an awful time next year when he starts school. We know that he's bright, but he's so funny when he's around other people. And they're so used to thinking he's dumb, I don't know what's going to happen to him. Sandy and I will sock anyone who picks on him, but that's all we can do. Let's not worry about next year till we get through this one, Miss Murray said. More French toast, boys? At school, Meg was tired, and her eyelids sagged and her mind wandered. In social studies, she was asked to name the principal imports and exports of Nicaragua, and though she had looked them up dutifully the evening before, now she could remember none of them. The teacher was sarcastic, the rest of the class laughed, and she flung herself down in her seat in a fury. Who cares about the imports and exports of Nicaragua? Anyhow, she muttered. If you're going to be rude, Margaret, you may leave the room, the teacher said. Okay, I will, Meg flounced out. During study hall, the principal sent for her. What seems to be the problem now, Meg? He asked pleasantly enough. Meg looked sulkily down at the floor. Nothing, Mr. Jenkins. Miss Porter tells me you were inexcusably rude. Meg shrugged. Don't you realize that you just make everything harder for yourself by that attitude? The principal asked. Now, Meg, I'm convinced that you could do the work and keep up your grade if you will apply yourself, but some of your teachers are not. You're going to have to do something about yourself. Nobody can do it for you. Meg was silent. Well, what about it, Meg? I don't know what to do, Meg said. You could do your homework, for one thing. Wouldn't your mother help you? If I asked her to. Meg, is something troubling you? Are you unhappy at home? Mr. Jenkins asked. At last Meg looked around, pushed at her glasses in a characteristic gesture. Everything's fine at home. I'm glad to hear it, but I know it must be hard on you to have your father away. Meg eyed the principal warily and ran her tongue over the barbed line of her braces. Have you had any news from him lately? Meg was sure it was not only imagination that made her feel that behind Mr. Jenkins' surface concern was a gleam of avid curiosity. Wouldn't he like to know, she thought. And if I knew anything, he's the last person I'd tell. Well, one of the last. The postmistress must know that it was almost a year now since the last letter. And heaven knows how many people she'd told. Or what unkind guesses she'd made about the reason for the long silence. Mr. Jenkins waited for an answer, but Meg only shrugged. Just what was your father's line of business? Mr. Jenkins asked. Some kind of scientist, wasn't he? He is a physicist. Meg bared her teeth to reveal the two ferocious lines of braces. Meg, don't you think you'd make a better adjustment to life if you faced facts? I do face facts, Meg said. They're a lot easier to face than people, I can tell you. Then why don't you face facts about your father? You leave my father out of it, Meg shouted. Stop bellowing, Mr. Jenkins said sharply. Do you want the entire school to hear you? So what? Meg demanded. I'm not ashamed of anything I'm saying. Are you? Mr. Jenkins sighed. Do you enjoy being the most belligerent, uncooperative child in school? Meg ignored this. She leaned over the desk towards the principal. Mr. Jenkins, you've met my mother, haven't you? You can't accuse her of not facing facts, can you? She's a scientist. She has a doctor's degree in both biology and bacteriology. Bacteriology? Yeah. Her business is facts. When she tells me that my father isn't coming home, I'll believe it. As long as she says father is coming home, then I'll believe that. Mr. Jenkins sighed again. No doubt your mother wants to believe that your father is coming home, Meg. Very well, I can't do anything else with you. Go on back to study hall. Try to be a little less antagonistic. Maybe your work would improve if your general attitude was a bit more tractable. Tractable? Okay. When Meg got home from school, her mother was in the lab. The twins were at Little League, and Charles Wallace the kitten and Fortinbras were waiting for her. Fortinbras jumped up, put his front paws on her shoulders, and gave her a kiss. The kitten rushed to his empty saucer, and mewed proudly. Come on, Charles Wallace said. Let's go. Where? Meg asked. I'm hungry, Charles. I don't want to go anywhere till I've had something to eat. Oh, thank you for the hydrate, Spook. Where were we? Ah, I don't want to go anywhere till I've had something to eat. She was still sore from the interview with Mr. Jenkins, and her voice sounded cross. Charles Wallace looked at her thoughtfully as she went to the refrigerator and gave the kittens some milk, then drank a mugful herself. He handed her a paper bag. Here is a sandwich and some cookies and an apple. I thought we'd better go see Mrs. Whatsit. Oh, golly, Meg said. Why, Charles? You're still uneasy about her, aren't you? Charles asked. Well, yes. Don't be. She's all right. I promise you. She's on our side. How do you know? Meg, he said impatiently. I know. But why should we go see her now? I want to find out more about that Tesseract thing. Didn't you see how it upset Mother? You know when Mother can't control the way she feels. She lets us see she's upset? Then it's something big. Meg thought for a moment. Okay, let's go. But let's take Fortinbras with us. Well, of course. He needs the exercise. They set off, Fortinbras rushing ahead, then doubling back to the two children, then leading off again. The Murrays lived about 4 miles out of the village. Behind the house was the pine woods, and it was through this that Charles Wallace took Meg. Charles, you know she's going to get in awful trouble. Mrs. Whatsit, I mean, if they find out she's broken into the haunted house. And taking Mrs. Buncombe's sheets and everything, they could send her to jail. One of the reasons I want to go over this afternoon is to warn them. Them? I told you, she was there with her 2 friends. I'm not even sure if it was Mrs. Whatsit herself who took the sheets, though I wouldn't put it past her. But what would she want all those sheets for? I intend to ask her, Charles Wallace said, and to tell them that they'd better be more careful. I don't really think they'd let anyone find them, but I just thought we ought to mention the possibility. Sometimes during vacation, some of the boys go out there looking for thrills, but I don't think anyone's apt to right now, what with basketball and everything. They walked in silence for a moment through the fragrant woods, the rusty pine needles gentle under their feet. Up above them, the wind made music in the branches. Charles Wallace slipped his hand confidently in Meg's, and the sweet little boy gesture warmed her so that she felt the tense knot inside her begin to loosen. Charles loves me at any rate, she thought. School awful again today? He asked after a while. Yes, I got sent to Mr. Jenkins. He made snide remarks about father. Charles Wallace nodded sagely. I know. How do you know? Charles Wallace shook his head. I can't quite explain. You tell me, that's all. But I never said anything. You just seem to know. Everything about you tells me, Charles said. How about the twins? Meg asked. Do you know about them too? I suppose I could if I wanted to, if they needed me, but it's sort of tiring, so I just concentrate on you and Mother. You mean you read our minds? Charles Wallace looked troubled. I don't think it's that. It's being able to understand a sort of language. Like sometimes, if I concentrate very hard, I can understand the wind talking with the trees. You tell me you see some sort of inadvertently. That's a good word, isn't it? I got Mother to look it up in the dictionary for me this morning. I really must learn to read, except I'm afraid it will make it awfully hard for me to go to school, or hard in school next year if I already know things. I think it will be better if people go on thinking I'm not very bright. They won't hate me quite so much. Ahead of them, Fortinbras started barking loudly. The warning bay that usually told them that a car was coming up the road or that someone was at the door. Somebody's here, Charles Wallace said sharply. Hey, Kamichi, how you doing? We are on Chapter 2 of A Wrinkle in Time. Somebody's here, Charles Wallace said sharply. Somebody's hanging around the house. Come on. He started to run, his short little legs straining. At the edge of the woods, Fortinbras stood in front of a boy, barking furiously. As they came panting up to the boy, for crying out loud, call off your dog, he said. Who is he? Charles Wallace asked Meg. Calvin O'Keefe. He's in regional, but he's older than I am. He's a big bug. All good, how are you? I am doing well today. I'm glad to hear you're doing well as well. It's alright, fella. I'm not gonna hurt you, the boy said to Fortinbras. Sit, Fort, Charles Wallace commanded, and Fortinbras dropped to his haunches in front of the boy, a low growl still pulsing in his dark throat. Okay, Charles Wallace put his hands on his hips. Now tell us what you're doing here. I might ask the same of you, the boy said with some indignation. Aren't you two of the Murray kids? This isn't your property, is it? He started to move, but Fortinbras's growl grew louder and he stopped. Tell me about him, Meg, Charles Wallace demanded. What would I know about him? Meg asked. He's a couple of grades above me, and he's on the basketball team. Just because I'm tall, Calvin sounded a little embarrassed. Tall, he certainly was, and skinny. His bony wrist stuck out of his sleeves of his blue sweater. His worn corduroy trousers were 3 inches too short. He had orange hair that needed cutting and the appropriate freckles to go with it. His eyes were oddly bright blue. Tell us what you're doing here, Charles Wallace said. What is this, the 3rd degree? Aren't you the one who's supposed to be the moron? Meg flushed with rage, but Charles Wallace answered placidly. That's right. If you want me to call my dog off, you'd better give. Most peculiar moron I've ever met, Calvin said. I just came to get away from my family. Charles Wallace nodded. What kind of family? They all have runny noses. I'm 3rd from the top of 11 kids. I'm a sport. At that, Charles Wallace grinned widely. So am I. I don't mean like in baseball, Calvin said. Neither do I. I mean like in biology, Calvin said suspiciously. A change in gene, Charles Wallace had quoted. Resulting in the appearance in the offspring of a character which is not present in the parents, but which is potentially transmissible to its offspring. What gives around here? Calvin asked. I was told you couldn't talk. Thinking I'm a moron gives people something to feel smug about, Charles Wallace said. Why should I disillusion them? How old are you, Cal? 14. What grade? Junior, 11th. I'm bright. Listen, did anyone ask you to come here this afternoon? Charles Wallace, holding Fort by the collar, looked at Calvin suspiciously. What do you mean, asked? Calvin shrugged. You still don't trust me, do you? Hi, Aqua. How are you doing? Let's see. Calvin shrugged. You still don't trust me, do you? I don't distrust you, Charles Wallace said. Do you want to tell me why you're here then? Fort and Meg and I decided to go for a walk. We often do in the afternoon. Calvin dug his hands down into his pockets. You're holding out on me. So are you, Charles Wallace said. Okay, old sport, Calvin said. I'll tell you this much. Sometimes I get a feeling about things. You might call it a compulsion. Do you know what a compulsion means? Constraint, obligation, because one is compelled. Not a very good definition, but it's concise Oxford. How is it going? It's going well so far. How are you doing today, Aqua? I hope you're doing well. Hug. Thank you for the hug. Okay, Calvin sighed. I must remember I'm preconditioned in my concept of your mentality. 40. That's a lie. Alright. Meg sat down on the coarse grass at the edge of the woods. Fort gently twisted his collar out of Charles Wallace's hand and came over to Meg, lying down beside her and putting his head in her lap. I'm doing better than in school? Fair enough, fair enough. Hopefully you can relax now. Calvin tried now politely to direct his words towards Meg as well as Charles Wallace. When I get this feeling, this compulsion, I always do what it tells me. I can't explain where it comes from or how I get it, and it doesn't happen very often. But I obey it, and this afternoon I had a feeling that I must come over to the haunted house. That's all I know, kid. I'm not holding anything back. Maybe it's because I'm supposed to meet you. You tell me. Charles Wallace looked at Calvin probingly for a moment. Then almost glazed Then an almost glazed look came into his eyes, and he seemed to be thinking at him. Calvin stood very still and waited. At last Charles Wallace said, "Okay, I believe you, but I can't tell you. I think I'd like to trust you. Maybe you'd better come home with us and have dinner." "Well, sure, but what would your mother say to that?" Calvin asked. "Sadly, we'll be going to school tomorrow because of my LA teacher's certain assignment that if I don't attend, I'll get a test for it." "Oh, I see. Well, I hope it goes well. Anyways, hope you're doing okay. I am doing rather well. And I do hope that it goes well tomorrow." She'd be delighted. Mother's all right. She's not one of us, but she's all right. Hydrate. Thank you for the hydrate. What about Meg? Meg has it tough, Charles Wallace said. She's not really one thing or the other. "What do you mean, one of us?" Meg demanded. "What do you mean I'm not one thing or the other?" "Not now, Meg," Charles Wallace said. "Slowly, I'll tell you about it later." My channel points didn't change? That's a bit weird. Hopefully, someone was saying they fixed it, but I don't know. Well, where was I? "Slowly, I'll tell you about it later." He looked at Calvin, then seemed to make a decision. "Okay, let's take him to meet Mrs. Whatsit. If he's not okay, she'll know." He started off on his short legs towards the dilapidated old house. The haunted house was half in the shadows of the clump of elms in which it stood. The elms were almost bare now. I've been getting channel points again. I don't know why though. Hopefully it fixes itself. Yeah. That's very weird. I do hope they can fix all their problems. Anyways, the elms were almost bare now, and the ground around the house was yellow with damp leaves. The late afternoon light had a greenish cast, which the blank windows reflected in a sinister way. An unhinged shutter thumped. Something else creaked. Meg did not wonder that the house had a reputation for being haunted. God, I'll do another redeem just in case if my thoughts are correct about this. Thank you for the pets, Aqua. A board was nailed across the front door, but Charles Wallace led the way around the back. The door there appeared to be nailed shut too, but Charles Wallace knocked, and the door swung slowly outward, creaking on rusty hinges. Up in one of the elms, an old black crow gave its ruck. I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. Rousis? Cry? Not 100% sure, but that'll be good enough then. And a woodpecker went on into a wild rat-a-tat-tat. A large gray rat scuttled along the corner of the house, and Meg let out a stifled shriek. Oh my god, my channel points are bugged. I used 600 and I'm still at 958. That is a bit odd. That is very odd. Try reloading then, maybe. They get a lot of fun out of using all of the typical props, Charles Wallace said in a reassuring voice. Come on, follow me. Wait, infinite pets and hydrates for the stream? I feel like it wouldn't be technically infinite, only that your client side was not actually reporting correctly. Anyways. Come on, follow me. Calvin put a strong hand to Meg's elbow, and Fort pressed against her leg. Happiness at their concern was so strong in her that her panic fled, and she followed Charles Wallace into the dark recesses of the house without fear. They entered into a sort of kitchen. There was a huge fireplace with a big black pot hanging over a merry fire. Why had there been no smoke visible from the chimney? Something in the pot was bubbling, and it smelled more like one of Mrs. Murray's chemical messes than something to eat. In a dilapidated Boston rocker sat a plump little woman. She wasn't Mrs. Whatsit, so she must, Meg decided, be one of Mrs. Whatsit's friends. She wore enormous spectacles, twice as thick and twice as large as Meg's, and she was sewing busily, with rapid jabbing stitches on a sheet. Several other sheets lay on the dusty floor. Never mind, it's just to display this bugs. I did use the points. Fair enough, fair enough. Where was I? There I was. Charles Wallace went up to her. I really don't think you ought to have taken Mrs. Buncombe's sheets without consulting me, he said, as cross and bossy as only a very small boy can be. What on earth did you want them for? The plump little woman beamed at him. Why, Charlesy, my pet. And then some French that I'm probably going to butcher, I apologize in advance. La cour a ces raisons que la raison ne connaît point? French, Pascal. The heart has its reasons, whereof reasons know nothing. Fair enough. But that's not appropriate at all, Charles said crossly. Your mother would find it so. A smile seemed to gleam through the roundness of spectacles. I'm not talking about my mother's feelings about my father, Charles Wallace scolded. I'm talking about Miss Buncombe's sheets. The little woman sighed. The enormous glasses caught the light again and shone like an owl's eyes. I think I've been getting channel points. It was just bugged because of what happened in Aggie's stream. What happened in Aggie's stream? The little woman sighed. The enormous glasses caught the light again and shone like an owl's eyes. In case we need ghosts, of course, she said. I should think you'd have guessed. If we have to frighten anyone away, what's it thought we ought to do it appropriately? That's why it's so much fun to stay in a haunted house. But we really didn't mean you to know about the sheets. Alfrischer hat I'm sorry, I can't pronounce German either. German. In Fraglant. And Latin, okay. Caught in the act. There we go. English, as I was saying. But Charles Wallace held up his hand in a preemptory gesture. Mrs. Who, do you know this boy? Calvin bowed. Good afternoon, ma'am. I didn't quite catch your name. Mrs. Who will do. The woman said, He wasn't my ideal Charlesy, but I think he's a good one. Where's Mrs. Whatsit? Charles asked. She's busy. It's getting near time, Charlesy. Getting near time. Seneca. I don't know how to pronounce that either, so we're going to skip to the English translation. Nothing deters a good man from doing what is honorable. And he's a very good man, Charlesy, darling. But right now, he needs our help. Who? Meg demanded. And little Megsy. Love to meet you, sweetheart. Your father, of course. Now go home, loves. The time is not yet right. Don't worry. We won't go without you. Get plenty of food and rest. Feed Calvin up. Now off with you. Latin again. Faith is the sister of justice. Trust in us? Now shoo. And she fluttered up from her chair and pushed them out the door with surprising power. Well, hope everything is going okay this fine evening. I hope so as well for you. Charles, Meg said, I don't understand. Charles took her by the hand and dragged her away from the house. Fortinbras ran on ahead, and Calvin was close behind them. No, he said. I don't either. Yet. Not quite. I'll tell you what I know as soon as I can. But you saw Ford, didn't you? Not a growl, not a quiver. Just as though there wasn't anything strange about it. So you know it's okay. Look, do me a favor, both of you. Let's not talk about it till we've had something to eat. I need fuel so I can sort things out and assimilate them properly. Lead on, moron, Calvin cried gaily. I've never even seen your house. I have the funniest feeling that, for the first time in my life, I'm going home. End of chapter 2. Let's see, how many chapters are in this book? There are 12 chapters. Alright. So I'm going to hydrate, and then we're going to start chapter 3. Oh my, we've been at this for about an hour. An hour for 2 chapters. There are 12 chapters. We may be here for 6 hours. Oh my goodness. Well, I'm gonna read the whole thing. Just a quick hydration, and, oh, thank you, Story, for the hydrate. I will hydrate again. Ah. The whole thing. Yes, Aggie, the whole thing. We will indeed be playing the whole, or, not playing, reading the whole thing. Can you read this? Hydration for the snack? I see. I'm getting channel points? Yay! That's good, that's good. Just the redeems weren't working? Ah, okay. Thank you, I got what I wanted. Fair enough, Eggy, fair enough. Welcome in, welcome in. How are you doing today? Hopefully you're doing well. We could be here a while, though. So I hope everybody's ready for some really long, cozy vibes. I'm fantastic. I'm glad to hear, glad to hear. Alright. Chapter 3. Mrs. Witch. In the forest, evening was already beginning to fall, and they walked in silence. Charles and Fortinbras gumbooled on ahead. Gumbooled, I've never heard that one before. Calvin walked with Meg, his fingers barely touching her arm in a protective gesture. This has been the most impossible, the most confusing afternoon of my life, she thought. Yet I don't feel confused or upset anymore. I only feel happy. Why? Maybe we weren't meant to meet before this, Calvin said. I mean, I knew who you were in school and everything, but I didn't know you. But I'm glad we've met now, Meg. We're going to be friends, you know? I'm glad too, Meg whispered, and they were silent again. When they got back to the house, Mrs. Murray was still in the lab. She was watching a pale blue fluid move slowly through a tube from a beaker to a retort. Over a Bunsen burner bubbled a big earthenware dish of stew. Don't tell Sandy and Dennis I'm cooking out here, she said. They're always suspicious that a few chemicals may get into the meat, but I had an experiment I wanted to stay with. Hi, Kanaza, how are you doing? This is Calvin O'Keefe, Mother, Meg said. Is there enough for him too? It smells super. Hello, Calvin. Mrs. Murray shook hands with him. Nice to meet you. We aren't having anything but stew tonight, but it's a good thick one. Sounds wonderful to me, Calvin said. May I use your phone so my mother will know where I am? Of course. Show him where it is, will you please, Meg? I won't ask you to use the one out here. If you don't mind, I'd like to finish up this experiment. I okay? Try not to die from heat? Well, I hope you can cool off soon, and I hope you can relax. Meg led the way into the house. Charles Wallace and Fortinbras had gone off. Outdoors, she could hear Sandy and Dennis hammering at the fort that they were building up in one of the maples. This way, Meg went through the kitchen and into the living room. I don't know why I called her when I don't come home. I don't know why I call her when I don't come home, Calvin said, his voice a little bitter. She wouldn't notice. He sighed and dialed. Ma, he said. Oh, Hinky. Tell Ma I won't be home till late. Now, don't forget. I don't want to be locked out again. He hung up, looking at Meg. Do you know how lucky you are? She smiled rather wryly. Not most of the time. A mother like that, a house like this? Gee, your mother's gorgeous. You should see my mother. She has all of her upper teeth out, and Pop got her a plate, but she won't wear it, and most days she doesn't even comb her hair. Not that it makes much of a difference when she does. He clenched his fists. But I love her. That's the funny part of it. I love them all, and they don't give a hoot about me. Maybe that's why I call when I'm not going to be home. Because I care. Nobody else does. You don't know how lucky you are to be loved. Meg said in a startled way. I guess I never thought of that. I guess I just took it for granted. I'm awake from the dead. Sorry I missed the beginning of stream. What I missed? We are in Chapter 3 of A Wrinkle in Time, but it's all okay, Satanic. I hope you slept well. I'm getting a little bit tongue-tied though already, so I'm trying to speak a little more intentionally with good words. Good words, yes. Calvin looked somber. Then his enormous smile lit up his face again. Things are going to happen, Meg. Good things. I feel it. Spook, I thought I told you to stop with the childish insults. Alright. He began wandering, still slowly, around the pleasant, if shabby, living room. He stopped before a picture on the piano of a small group of men standing together on a beach. Who's this? Oh, a bunch of scientists. Where? Meg went over to the picture. Cape Canaveral. That one's father. Which? Here. The one with glasses? Yep, the one who needs a haircut. Meg giggled, forgetting her worries in her pleasure at showing Calvin the picture. His hair's sort of the same color as mine. And he keeps forgetting to have it cut. Mother usually ends up doing it for him. She bought clippers and stuff, because he won't take the time to go to the barber. Calvin studied the picture. I like him. he announced judiciously. Looks kind of like Charles Wallace, doesn't he? Meg laughed again. When Charles was a baby, he looked exactly like Father. It was really funny. Calvin continued to look at the picture. He's not handsome or anything, but I like him. Meg was indignant. He is too handsome? Calvin shook his head. Nah, he's tall and skinny. Like me. Well, I think you're handsome, Meg said. Father's eyes are kind of like yours too. You know, really blue. Only you don't notice his as much because of the glasses. Where is he now? Meg stiffened. But she didn't have an answer because the door from the lab to the kitchen slammed and Mrs. Murray came in carrying a dish of stew. Now, she called, I'll finish this up properly on the stove. Have you done your homework, Meg? Not quite, Meg said, going back into the kitchen. And I'm sure Calvin won't mind if you finish before dinner. Sure, go ahead. Calvin fished in his pocket and pulled out a wad of folded paper. As a matter of fact, I have some junk of mine to finish up. I am okay, sick but alive, just gonna chill and enjoy the stream of Mama's Neck. That is completely okay, Satanic. I hope that you feel better. Where was I? Ah, junk to finish up. Math. That's one thing I have a hard time keeping up in. I'm okay on anything to do with words, but I don't do well with numbers. Mrs. Murray smiled. Why don't you get Meg to help you? But see, I'm several grades above Meg. Well, try asking her to help you with your math anyhow, Mrs. Murray suggested. Well, sure, Calvin said. Here. But it's pretty complicated. Meg smoothed out the paper and studied it. Do they care how you do it? She asked. I mean, can you work it out in your own way? Well, sure, as long as I understand and get the answers right. Well, we have to do it their way. Now look, Calvin. Don't you see how much easier it would be if you did it this way? Her pencil flew over the paper. Hey, Calvin said. Hey, I think I get it. Show me once more on the other one. Again, Meg's pencil was busy. All you have to do is remember that one more time. All you have to remember is that every ordinary fraction can be converted into an infinite periodic decimal fraction. See? So 3/7 is 0.428571. This is the craziest family, Calvin grinned at her. I suppose I should stop being surprised by now, but you're supposed to be dumb in school, always being called up on the carpet. Oh, I am. The trouble with Meg and math, Mrs. Murray said briskly, is that Meg and her father used to play with numbers, and Meg learned far too many shortcuts. So when they want her to do problems the long way around at school, she gets sullen and stubborn and sets up a fine mental block for herself. Are there any more morons like Meg and Charles around? Calvin asked. If so, I should like to meet more of them. It might also help if Meg's handwriting were legible, Mrs. Murray said. With a good deal of difficulty I can usually decipher it, but I doubt very much if her teachers can, or are willing to take the time. I'm planning on giving her a typewriter for Christmas. That may be a help. If I can get anything right, nobody'll believe it's me, Meg said. What's a megaparsec? Calvin asked. One of Father's nicknames for me, Meg said. It's also 3.26 million light years. What's E equals mc squared? Einstein's equation. What does E stand for? Energy. M, mass. C squared, the square of the velocity of light in centimeters per second. By what countries is Peru bounded? I haven't the faintest idea. I think it's in South America somewhere. What's the capital of New York? Why, New York City, of course. Who wrote Boswell's Life of Johnson? Oh, Calvin, I'm not any good at English. Wait, wouldn't Boswell have written Boswell's life? Anyways. Calvin groaned and turned to Mrs. Murray. I see what you mean. Her I wouldn't want to teach. She's a little one-sided, I grant you, Mrs. Murray said, though I blame her father and myself for that. She still enjoys playing with her dolls, though. Mother! Meg shrieked in agony. Oh, darling, I'm sorry, Mrs. Murray said swiftly, but I'm sure Calvin understands what I mean. Hope you feel better, Satanic. Keep on resting while you listen to Mama. Yeah. Yes, please get some rest. Please take care of yourself, okay? Alright. Where were we? Oh yes, but I'm sure Calvin understands what I mean. With a sudden enthusiastic gesture, Calvin flung his arms out wide, as though he was embracing Meg and her mother, the whole house. How did all this happen? Isn't it wonderful? I feel as though I was just being born. I'm not alone anymore. Do you realize what that means to me? But you're good at basketball and things, Meg protested. You're good in school. Everybody likes you. For all the most unimportant reasons, Calvin said. There hasn't been anybody in the world I could talk to. Sure, I can function on the same level as everyone else. I can hold myself down, but it isn't me. Meg took a batch of forks from the drawer and turned them over and over, looking at them. I'm all confused again. Oh, so am I, Calvin said gaily. But at least now I know we're going somewhere. Meg was pleased and a little surprised when the twins were excited at having Calvin for supper. They knew more about his athletic record and were far more impressed by it than she. Calvin ate 5 bowls of stew, 3 saucers of Jell-O, and a dozen cookies. And then Charles Wallace insisted that Calvin take him up to bed and read to him. The twins, who had finished their homework, were allowed to watch a half-hour of TV. Meg helped her mother with the dishes and then sat at the table and struggled with her homework. But she could not concentrate. "Mother, are you upset?" she asked suddenly. Mrs. Murray looked up from a copy of English Scientific Magazine, through which she was leafing for a moment. Oh wait, no, there's a period there that's off screen, okay. Through which she was leafing. For a moment, she did not speak. Then, yes. Why? Again, Mrs. Murray paused. She held her hands out and looked at them. They were long and strong and beautiful. She touched with the fingers of her right hand the broad gold band on her third finger of her left hand. Still quite a young woman, you know, she said finally, though I realize that that's difficult for you children to conceive. And I'm still very much in love with your father. I miss him quite dreadfully. And you think this has something to do with father? I think it must have. But what? That I don't know. But it seems the only explanation. Do you think things always have an explanation? Yes, I believe they do. But I think that with our human limitations, we're not always able to understand the explanations. But you see, Meg, just because we don't understand doesn't mean that the explanations don't exist. I like to understand things, Meg said. We all do, but it isn't always possible. Charles Wallace understands more than the rest of us, doesn't he? Yes. Why? I suppose because he's... well, because he's different, Meg. Different how? I'm not quite sure. You know yourself, he's not like anybody else. No, and I don't want him to be, Meg said defensively. Wanting doesn't have anything to do with it. Charles Wallace is what he is. Different. New. New? Yes, that's what your father and I feel. Meg twisted her pencil so hard that it broke. She laughed. I'm sorry, I'm really not being destructive. I'm just trying to get things straight. I know. But Charles Wallace doesn't look different from anyone else. No, Meg, but people are just more than the way that they look. Charles Wallace's differences isn't physical, it's in essence. Meg sighed heavily, took off her glasses and twirled them, putting them back on again. Well, I know Charles Wallace is different, and I know he's something more. I guess I'll just have to accept it without understanding it. Mrs. Murray smiled at her. Maybe that's really the point I was trying to put across. Sending lots of love, from Eggy, yes. All the love to Satanic. All the love indeed. Where was I? Her mother smiled again. Maybe that's why our visitor last night didn't surprise me. Maybe that's why I'm able to have a willing suspension of disbelief. Because of Charles Wallace. Are you like Charles? Meg asked. I? Heavens, no. I'm blessed with more brains and opportunities than many people, but there's nothing about me that breaks out of the ordinary mold. Your looks do, Meg said. Mrs. Murray laughed. You just haven't had enough basis for comparison, Meg. I'm very ordinary, really. Calvin O'Keefe coming in said, Ha ha. Charles all settled? Mrs. Murray asked. Yes. What did you read to him? Genesis, by his choice. By the way, what kind of an experiment were you two working on this afternoon, Mrs. Murray? Oh, something my husband and I were cooking up together. I don't want to be too far behind him when he gets back. Mother, Meg pursued, Charles says it's not one thing or another. Or Charles says I'm not one thing or another. Not flesh, nor fowl, nor good red herring. Mother, whoop, the wrong line. Oh, for crying out loud, Calvin said. You're Meg, aren't you? Come on, let's go for a walk. But Meg was not satisfied. And what do you make of Calvin? She demanded of her mother. Mrs. Murray laughed. I don't want to make anything of Calvin. I like him very much. I'm delighted he's found his way here. Mother, you were going to tell me about a tesseract. Yes. A troubled look came into Mrs. Murray's eyes. But not now, Meg. Not now. Go on out for that walk with Calvin. I'm going up to kiss Charles, and then I have to see the twins get to bed. Outdoors, the grass was wet with dew. The moon was halfway up and dimmed the stars for a great arc. Calvin reached out and took Meg's hand with a gesture as simple and friendly as Charles Wallace's. Were you upsetting your mother? He asked gently. I don't think I was, but she's upset. What about, father? Calvin led Meg across the lawn. The shadows of the trees were long and twisted, and there was a heavy, sweet autumnal smell in the air. Meg stumbled as the land sloped suddenly downhill, but Calvin's strong hand steadied her. They walked carefully across the twins' vegetable garden, picking their way through rows of cabbages, beets, broccoli, pumpkins. Looming on their left were the tall stalks of corn. Ahead of them was a small apple orchard, bounded by a stone wall, and beyond this, the woods through which they had walked that afternoon. Calvin led the way to the wall, and then sat there, his red hair shining silver in the moonlight. His body dappled with patterns from the tangle of branches. He reached up, pulled an apple off a gnarled limb, and handed it to Meg, then picked one for himself. Tell me about your father. He's a physicist. Sure, we all know that, and he's supposed to have left your mother and gone off with some dame. Meg jerked up from the stone on which she was perched, but Calvin already grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her back down. Hold it, kid. I didn't say anything you hadn't heard already, did I? No, Meg said, but continued to pull away. Let me go. Come on, calm down. You know it isn't true. I know it isn't true. And how anybody, after one look at your mother, could believe any man would leave her for another woman just shows how far jealousy will make people go, right? I guess so, Meg said, but her happiness had fled and she went back into a morass of anger and resentment. Look, Dope, Calvin shook her gently. I just want to get things straight. Sort out the fact from fiction. Your father's a physicist, that's a fact. Yes? Yes. He's a PhD several times over? Yes. Most of the time he works, but some of the time he was at the Institute for Higher Learning in Princeton, correct? Yes. Then he did some work for the government, didn't he? Yes. You take it from there? That's all I know. Oh, thank you for the hug, Yahir. That's about all I know too, Meg said. Maybe Mother knows more. I don't know. What he did was, well, it was what they call classified. Top secret, you mean? That's right. And you don't even have any idea what it was about. Meg shook her head. No, not really. Just an idea because of where he was. Well, where? Out in New Mexico for a while. We were there with him. We were with him there. Then he was in Florida at Cape Canaveral. We were with him there too. Then he was going to be traveling a lot, so we came here. You've always had this house? Yes, but we used to live in it just in the summer. And you don't know where your father got sent? No. At first, we got lots of letters. Mother and Father always wrote each other every day. I think Mother still writes him at night. Every once in a while, the postmistress makes some kind of a crack about all her letters. I suppose they think she's pursuing him or something, Calvin said, rather bitterly. They can't understand plain, ordinary love when they see it. Well, go on. What happened next? Nothing happened, Meg said. That's the trouble. Well, what about your father's letters? They just stopped coming. You haven't heard anything at all? No, Meg said. Nothing. Her voice was heavy with misery. Silence fell between them, as tangible as the dark shadows that fell across their laps, that now seemed to rest upon them heavily as though they possessed a measurable weight of their own. At last Calvin spoke in a dry, unemotional tone, not looking at Meg. "Do you think he could be dead?" Again Meg leapt up, and again Calvin pulled her down. "No, they'd have told us if he were dead. There's always a telegram or something. They always tell you." "What do they tell you?" Meg choked down a sob and managed to speak over it. "Oh, Calvin, Mother's tried and tried to find out. She's been down to Washington and everything. And all they say is that he's on a secret and dangerous mission, and she can be very proud of him, but he won't be able to communicate with us for a while. And they've given us news as soon as they... and they'll give us news as soon as they have it. Meg, don't get mad, but do you think maybe they don't know?" A slow tear trickled down Meg's cheek. "That's what I'm afraid of." "Why don't you cry?" Calvin asked gently. "You're just as crazy about your father, aren't you? Go ahead and cry. It'll do you good." Meg's voice came out over trembled tears. "I cry much too much. I should be like Mother. I should be able to control myself." "Your mother's a completely different person, and she's a lot older than you are." "I wish I were a different person," Meg said shakily. "I hate myself." Calvin reached over and took off her glasses, and he put a handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped her tears. This gesture of tenderness undid her completely, and she put her head down on her knees and sobbed. Calvin sat quietly beside her, every once in a while patting her head. "I'm sorry," she sobbed finally. "I'm terribly sorry. Now you'll hate me." Aww. "Oh, Meg, you are a moron," Calvin said. "Don't you know you're the nicest thing that's happened to me in a long time?" Meg raised her head and moonlight shone on her tear-stained face. Without the glasses, her eyes were unexpectedly beautiful. "If Charles Wallace is a sport, I think I'm a biological mistake." Moonlight flashed against her braces as she spoke. Now she was waiting to be contradicted, but Calvin said, "Do you think that this is the first time I have seen you without your glasses?" "I'm blind as a bat without them. I'm nearsighted, like Father." "Well, you know what? You've got dreamboat eyes," Calvin said. "Listen, you go right on wearing your glasses. I don't think I want anybody else to see what gorgeous eyes you have." Aww. Meg smiled with pleasure. She could feel herself blushing, and she wondered if the blush would be visible in the moonlight. "Okay, hold it, you two," came a voice out of the shadows. Charles Wallace stepped into the moonlight. "I wasn't spying on you," he said quickly. "I hate to break things up, but this is it, kids. This is it." His voice quivered with excitement. "This is what?" Calvin asked. "We're going." "Going? Where?" Meg reached out and instinctively grabbed for Charles's hand. "I don't know exactly, but I think it's to find Father." Suddenly, two eyes seemed to spring at them out of the darkness. It was the moonlight striking on Mrs. Who's glasses. She was standing next to Charles Wallace, and how she had managed to appear where a moment ago there had been nothing but flickering shadows in the moonlight, Meg had no idea. But she heard a sound behind her and turned around. There was Mrs. Whatsit scrambling over a wall. "My, but I wish there was no wind," Mrs. Whatsit said plaintively. "It's so difficult with all these clothes." She wore her outfit of the night before, rubber boots and all, with the addition of one of Mrs. Buncombe's sheets which she had draped over her. As she slid off the wall, the sheet caught in a low branch and came off. Felt hat slipped over both eyes, and another branch plucked at the pink stole. "Oh dear," she sighed, "I shall never learn to manage." Mrs. Who wafted over to her, tiny feet scarcely seeming to touch the ground, the lenses of her glasses glittering. Something from Dante. What a grievous pain a little fault doth give thee. I see." With a claw-like hand, she pushed the hat up on Mrs. Whatsit's forehead, untangled the stole from the tree, and with a deft gesture took the sheet and folded it. "Oh, thank you. You're so clever." A quote from A. Perez. "An old ass knows more than a young colt." "Just because you're a paltry few billion years," Mrs. Whatsit was starting indignantly when a strange, sharp voice cut in. All right, girls, this is no time for bickering. It's Mrs. Witch, Charles Wallace said. There was a faint gust of wind, the leaves shivering in it, the patterns of moonlight shifted, and in a circle of silver something shimmered, quivered, and the voice said, I do not think I will materialize completely. I find it very tiring, and we have much to do. End of chapter 3. Oh, right. Let me get some hydration, and we'll start on chapter 4. Okay. Chapter 4. The Black Thing. The trees were lashed into a violent frenzy. Meg screamed and clutched at Calvin, and Mrs. Witch's authoritative voice called out, Quiet, child. Did a shadow fall across the moon, or did the moon simply go out? Extinguished as abruptly and completely as a candle. There was still the sound of leaves, a terrified, terrifying rushing. All light was gone, darkness was complete. Suddenly, the wind was gone, and all sound. Meg felt that Calvin was being torn from her. When she reached for him, her fingers touched nothing. She screamed out, Charles! And whether it was to help him, whether it was to help him or for him to help her, she did not know. The word was flung back down her throat and she choked on it. She was completely alone. How many chapters does this book have? It has 12 chapters. Also, yeah, we did hit 1,110 hugs. She had lost the protection of Calvin's hand. Charles was nowhere, either to save or to turn to. She was alone in the fragment of nothingness. No light, no sound, no feeling. Where was her body? She tried to move in her panic, but there was nothing to move. Just as light and sound had vanished, she was gone too. The corporeal Meg simply was not. Then she felt her limbs again. Her legs and arms were tingling faintly, as though they had been asleep. She blinked her eyes rapidly. But though she herself was somehow back, nothing else was. It was not as simple as darkness, or absence of light. Darkness has a tangible quality. It can be moved through and felt. In darkness, you can bark your shins. The world of things still exists around you. She was lost in a horrifying void. It was the same way with the silence. There was more than silence. A deaf person can feel vibrations. Here, there was nothing to feel. Suddenly, she was aware of her heart beating rapidly within the cage of her ribs. Had it stopped before? What had made it start again? The tingling in her arms and legs grew stronger, and suddenly, she felt movement. This movement, she felt, must be the turning of the Earth, rotating on its axis, traveling its elliptic course around the sun. And this feeling of moving with the Earth was somewhat like the feeling of being in the ocean. Out in the ocean, beyond the rising and falling of the breakers, lying on the moving water, pulsing gently with the swells, and feeling the gentle, inexorable tug of the moon. I am asleep. I am dreaming, she thought. I'm having a nightmare. I want to wake up. Let me wake up. Hi, Maddie. Welcome back, welcome back. How are you doing? Hopefully you're doing well. Well, Charles Wallace's voice said, that was quite a trip. I do think you might have warned us. Light began to pulse and quiver. Meg blinked and shoved shakily at her glasses. There was Charles Wallace, standing indignantly in front of her, his hands on his hips. Meg! He shouted. Calvin, where are you? Love you so much, sending hugs and support. Hope stream is going well. It is going well so far. I'm glad you could pop back in. I hope you're doing well as well. Oh, let's see. She saw Charles. She heard him, but she could not go to him. She could not shove through the strange, trembling light to meet him. Calvin's voice, as though it were pushing through a cloud. Well, just give me time, will you? I'm older than you are. Tad overstimulated, but doing good overall. Well, we do have a low stimulation environment right now where I'm reading a book, so I hope that it helps. Meg gasped. It wasn't that Calvin wasn't there, and then that he was. It wasn't that part of him came first and the rest of him followed, like a hand and then an arm and an eye and a nose. It was sort of a shimmering, a looking at Calvin through water, through smoke, through fire, and then there he was, solid and reassuring. Meg, Charles Wallace's voice came. Meg? Calvin, where's Meg? I'm right here, she tried to say, but her voice seemed to be caught at its source. Meg! Calvin cried, and he turned around, looking around wildly. Mrs. Witch, you haven't left Meg behind, have you? Charles Wallace shouted. If you've hurt Meg, any of you, Calvin started, but suddenly Meg felt a violent push and shattered as though she had been thrust through a wall of glass. Oh, there you are, Charles Wallace said, and rushed over to her and hugged her. But where am I? Meg asked breathlessly, relieved to hear that her voice was now coming out of her in a more or less normal way. I love this book. Wrinkle in Time was my favorite book when I was little. Honestly, same. It was one that I consistently, repeatedly read. Let's see, where was I? Ah, yes. She can talk now. She looked around rather wildly. They were standing in a sunlit field, and the air around them was moving with a delicious fragrance that comes only from the rarest of spring days, when the sun's touch is gentle and the apple blossoms are just beginning to unfold. She pushed her glasses up her nose to reassure herself that what she was seeing was real. They had left the silver glint of the biting autumn evening, and now around them everything was golden with light. The grasses of the field were a tender new green, and scattered around were tiny multicolored flowers. Literally the best children's sci-fi? Fair. A fair observation there. Meg turned slowly to face a mountain, reaching so high into the sky that its peak was lost in a crown of fluffy pink clouds. Hi Reed, how you doing? Yeah, you came into another reading stream. Hopefully you've been doing well. From the trees at the base of the mountain came a sudden singing of birds. There was an air of such ineffable peace and joy around her that her heart's wild thumping slowed. When shall three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Never heard of this book until like half a month ago? Oh, well hopefully you're enjoying it. Anyways, I think I need to reread that line so that it actually makes sense. Hi Reed, yes. There was an air of such ineffable peace and joy all around her that her heart's wild thumping slowed. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Came Mrs. Who's voice. Suddenly, the three of them were there. Mrs. Whatsit with her pink stole askew, Mrs. Who with her spectacles gleaming, and Mrs. Witch, still little more than a shimmer. Delicate, multicolored butterflies were fluttering around them as though in greeting. Same Aqua, fair? Can't stay for long, so I'll have to check out the VOD, but I send lots of love to everyone and hope the rest of the stream goes absolutely wonderfully. Oh, thank you, Maddie. I hope that the rest of your night goes well. Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who began to giggle, and they giggled until it seemed that whatever their private joke was, it would fall down with the wild fun of it. The shimmer seemed to be laughing, too. It became vaguely darker and more solid, and then there appeared a figure in a black robe and a black-peaked hat, beady eyes, a beaked nose, and long gray hair. One bony claw clutched a broomstick. Well, just to keep you girls happy, the strange voice said, and Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who fell into each other's arms in gales of laughter. If you ladies have had your fun, I think you should tell Calvin and Meg a little more about all this, Charles Wallace said coldly. You scared Meg half out of her wits, whisking her off this way without any warning. Mrs. Who intones a quote from Horace, "To action little, less to words inclined." Mrs. Who, I wish you'd stop quoting. Charles Wallace sounded very annoyed. Mrs. Watchett adjusted her stole. But she finds it so difficult to verbalize, Charles dear. It helps her if she can quote instead of working out words on her own. And we mustn't lose our sense of humor, Mrs. Witch said. The only way to cope with something deadly serious is to try to treat it a little lightly. Just as a side note, anytime that Mrs. Witch is talking, there are so many fucking repeated letters that I am having a stroke trying to read that. But, yeah. But that's going to be hard for Meg, Mrs. Whatsit said. It's going to be hard for her to realize that we are serious. What about me? Calvin asked. The life of your father isn't at stake, Mrs. Whatsit told him. What about Charles Wallace, then? Mrs. What's-it unoiled door hinge voice was warm with affection and pride. Charles Wallace knows. Charles Wallace knows that it's far more than just the life of his father. Charles Wallace knows what's at stake. But remember, Mrs. Who said, those are some Greek letters that I don't even know the pronunciation of. From Euripides. Nothing is hopeless, we must hope for everything. Where are we now? And how did we get here? Calvin asked. Uriel, the third planet of the star Malak, in the spiral nebula Messier 101. This I'm supposed to believe? Calvin asked indignantly. As you like, Mrs. Witch said coldly. For some reason, Meg felt that Mrs. Witch, despite her looks and ephemeral broomstick, was someone in whom one could put complete trust. It doesn't seem any more peculiar than anyone else, or than anything else that's happened. Well then, someone just tell me how we got here. Calvin's voice was still angry and his freckles seemed to stand out on his face. Even traveling at the speed of light, it would take us years and years to get here. Oh, we didn't travel at the speed of anything, Mrs. What's-it explained earnestly. We tesser, or you might say, we wrinkle. Clear as mud, Calvin said. Tesser, Meg thought. Could that have anything to do with Mother's tesseract? She was about to ask when Miss Witch started to speak, and one did not interrupt when Miss Witch was speaking. What is young and naive? Mrs. What's-it is young and naive. She keeps thinking she can explain things in words, Mrs. Who said. Some more French that I'm not going to butcher. The more a man knows, the less he talks. That's a very fair statement. But she has to use words for Meg and Calvin, Charles reminded Mrs. Who. If you brought them along, they have a right to know what's going on. Meg went up to Mrs. Witch. In the intensity of her questions, she had forgotten all about the tesseract. Is my father here? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not here, Meg. Let Mrs. What's-it explain. She is young, and the language of words is easier for her than it is for Mrs. Who and me. We stopped here, Mrs. What's-it explained, more or less to catch our breaths, and to give you a chance to know what you're up against. But what about Father? Meg asked. Is he all right? For the moment, love, yes. He's one of the reasons we're here. But you see, he's only one. Well, where is he? Please take me to him. We can't, not yet, Charles said. You have to be patient, Meg. But I'm not patient, Meg cried passionately. I've never been patient. Mrs. Who's glasses shone at her gently. If you want to help your father, then you must learn patience. To stake one's life for the truth. That is what we must do. That is what your father is doing, Mrs. What's-it nodded, her voice, like Mrs. Who's, very serious and solemn. Then she smiled her radiant smile. Now, why don't you three children wander around and Charles can explain things a little? You're perfectly safe on Uriel. That's why we stopped here to rest. But aren't you coming with us? Meg asked fearfully. There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Witch raised her authoritative hand. Show them, she said to Mrs. What's-it, and at something in her voice, Meg felt prickles of apprehension. Now, Mrs. What's-it asked, her creaky voice rising to a squeak. Whatever it was that Mrs. Witch wanted them to see, it was something that made Mrs. What's-it uncomfortable too. Now, Mrs. Witch said, they may as well know. Should I change? Mrs. What's-it asked. Better. I hope it won't upset the children too much, Mrs. What's-it murmured, as she thought to herself. Should I change too? Mrs. Who asked. Oh, but I've had fun in these clothes. But I'll have to admit Mrs. What's-it is the best at it. The work proves the craftsman. Shall I transform now too? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not yet, not here. You may wait. Now don't be frightened, loves, Mrs. What's-it said. Her plump little body began to shimmer, to quiver, to shift. The wild colors of her clothes became muted, whitened. The pudding bag shape stretched, lengthened, and merged. And suddenly, before the children was a creature more beautiful than any Meg had ever imagined. And the beauty lay in far more than the outward description. Outwardly, Mrs. What's-it was surely no longer a Mrs. What's-it. She was a marble white body with powerful flanks, something like a horse, but at the same time completely unlike a horse. For, From the magnificently modeled back sprang two nobly formed torso, or sprang a nobly formed torso, arms, and a head resembling a man's, but a man with the perfection of dignity and virtue. An exaltation of joy such as Meg had never seen. Hug, thank you for the hug. No, she thought, it's not like a Greek centaur, not in the least. From the shoulders, slowly, a pair of wings unfolded. Wings made of rainbows, a light upon water of poetry. Calvin fell to his knees. Quick, make a wish, it's April all over again. Gosh. No, Mrs. Whatsit said, though her voice was not Mrs. Whatsit's voice. Not to me, Calvin. Never to me. Stand up. Carry them, Mrs. Witch said. With a gesture, both delicate and strong, Mrs. Whatsit knelt in front of the children, stretching her wings wide and holding them steady but quivering. Onto my back now, the new voice said. The children took hesitant steps towards the beautiful creature. But what do we call you now? Calvin asked. Oh, my dears, came the new voice, a rich voice, with the warmth of I almost said wormwood, that's completely different. With the warmth of woodwind, clarity of a trumpet, the mastery of the English horn. You can't go on changing my name each time I metamorphose, and I've had such a pleasure being Mrs. Whatsit that I think I'd better keep to that. She, he, it smiled at them, and the radiance of the smile was as tangible as a soft breeze, as directly warming as the rays of the sun. Come! Charles Wallace climbed up. Meg and Calvin followed him, Meg sitting between the two boys. A tremor went through the great wings, and then Mrs. Whatsit lifted off and moved through the air. Meg soon found that there was no need to cling to Charles Wallace or Calvin. The great creature's flight was serenely smooth. The boys were eagerly looking around the landscape. Look, Charles Wallace pointed. The mountains are so tall that you can't see where they end. Meg looked upward, and indeed, the mountains seemed to be reaching into infinity. They left the fertile fields and flew across a great plateau of granite-like rock shaped into enormous monoliths. These had definite rhythmic form, but they were not statues. They were nothing like Meg had ever seen before. And she wondered if they were made by wind and weather, by the formation of this earth, or if they were the creation of beings like the one on which she rode. Heavy! 363. Accurate, lol. Hopefully you're doing well today. Oh, where were we? Oh, yes. They left the great granite plain and flew over a garden, even more beautiful than anything in the dream. In it were gathered many of the creatures like the one Mrs. Whatsit had become, some lying among the flowers, some swimming in a broad crystal river that flowed through the garden, some flying in what Meg was sure must have been a kind of dance, moving in and out above the trees. They were making music, music that came not only from their throats, but also from the movement of their great wings as well. Hi, Heavy. Yes, hello indeed. What are they singing? Meg asked excitedly. Mrs. Whatsit shook her beautiful head. It won't go into your words. I can't possibly transfer it to your words. Are you getting any of it, Charles? Charles Wallace sat very still on the broad back, on his face an intently listening look. The look he had when he delved into Meg or his mother. A little, just a little, but I think I could get more in time. Yes, you could learn it, Charles, but there isn't time. We can only stay here long enough to rest up and make a few preparations. Meg hardly listened to her. I want to know what they're saying. I want to know what it means. Try, Charles, Mrs. Whatsit urged. Try to translate. You can let yourself go now. You don't have to hold back. But I can't, Charles Wallace cried in an anguished voice. I don't know enough, not yet. Then try to work with me, and I'll see if I can't verbalize it a little for them. Charles Wallace got his look of probing, of listening. I know that look, Meg thought suddenly. Now I think I know what it means. Because I've had it myself sometimes, doing math with Father, and a problem is just about to become clear. Mrs. Whatsit seemed to be listening to Charles' thoughts. Well, yes, that's an idea. I can try. Too bad you don't really know it, so you can give it to me direct, Charles. So much more work this way. Don't be lazy, Charles said. Mrs. Whatsit did not take offense. She explained, Oh, it's my favorite kind of work, Charles. That's why they chose me to go along, even though I'm so much younger. It's my one real talent. But it takes a tremendous amount of energy, and we're going to need every ounce of energy for what's ahead of us, but I'll try. For Calvin and Meg, I'll try. She was silent. The great wings almost stopped moving. Only a delicate stirring seemed to keep them aloft. Listen, then, Mrs. Whatsit said. The resonant voice rose, and the words seemed to be all around them, so that Meg felt that she could reach out and touch them. Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of the earth. Yea, that go down into the sea, and all that is therein, the isles, the inhabitants thereof. Let the wilderness and the cities lift their voice, let the inhabitants of the rocks sing, let them shout from the top of the mountain, let them give glory unto the Lord. Well, that seems like a religious thing. Okay. Throughout her entire body, Meg felt a pulse of joy as she had never known before. Calvin's hand reached out. He did not clasp her hand in his. He moved his fingers so that they were barely touching hers. Oop, thank you for the words, please. Thank you for the hydrate story. We presenting a cult in this book? I'm sure you could call it that. Where were we? Oh yes. But joy flowed through them, back and forth between them, around them, and about them, and inside them. When Mrs. Whatsit sighed, it seemed completely incomprehensible that through this bliss could come the faintest whisper of doubt. We must go now, children. Mrs. Whatsit's voice was deep with sadness, and Meg could not understand. Raising her head, Mrs. Whatsit gave a call that seemed to be a command, and one of the creatures flying above the trees near them raised its head to listen, and then flew off and picked 3 flowers from a growing tree near the river and brought them over. Each of you take one, Mrs. Whatsit said, and I'll tell you how to use them later. As Meg took her flowers, she realized it was not a single blossom, but hundreds of tiny flowerets forming up into a kind of hollow bell. Where are we going? Calvin asked. Up. The wings moved steadily, swiftly. The garden was left behind, the stretch of granite, the mighty shapes, and then Mrs. Whatsit was flying upwards, climbing steadily up, up. Below them, the trees of the mountain dwindled, became sparse, and were replaced by bushes and then small dry grasses, and then vegetation ceased entirely, and there were only rocks. Points and peaks of rock, sharp and dangerous. Hold on tight, Mrs. Whatsit said. Don't slip. Meg felt Calvin's arm circle her waist in a secure hold. Still, they moved upwards. Now they were in clouds. They could see nothing but drifting whiteness, and the moisture clung to them and condensed into icy droplets. Better now. Gwen and Unley cheered me up, and Em and my girlfriend gave me a safe space as a sounding board, and I can relax with the actual bedtime story for the Snake Waifu. I'm glad to hear that you're doing better, Heavy. I'm very glad to hear that. As Meg shivered, Calvin's grip tightened. In front of her, Charles Wallace sat quietly. Once he had turned just long enough to give her a swift glance of tenderness and concern, but Meg felt as each moment passed that he was growing farther and farther away. It was becoming less and less her adored baby brother, and more one of whatever kind of being Miss Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which in actuality were. Abruptly, they burst out of the clouds into a shaft of light. Below them, there were still rocks. Above them, the rocks continued to reach up into the sky. But now, it seemed miles upwards. Meg could see where the mountains came at last to an end. And let's scroll down. Mrs. Whatsit continued to climb, her wings straining a little. Meg felt her heart racing. Cold sweat began to gather on her face, and her lips felt as though they were turning blue. She began to gasp. All right, children, use your flowers now, Mrs. Whatsit said. The atmosphere will continue to get thinner from now on. Hold the flowers up to your face and breathe through them, and they will give you enough oxygen. It won't be as much as you're used to, but it will be enough. Meg had almost forgotten the flowers, and was grateful to realize that she was still clasping them, that she hadn't let them fall from her fingers. "Thank you for the hug, Aqua." She pressed her face into the blossoms and breathed deeply. Calvin still held her with one arm, but he too held the flowers to his face. Charles Wallace moved his hand with the flower slowly, almost as though he was in a dream. Mrs. Whatsit wings strained against the thinness of the atmosphere. The summit was only a little way above them, and then they were there. Mrs. Whatsit came to a rest on a small plateau of smooth silvery rock. There ahead of them was a great white disk, one of Uriel's moons, Mrs. Whatsit told them, her mighty voice faintly breathless. "Oh, it's beautiful," Meg cried. "It's beautiful." The silver light from the enormous moon poured over them, blending with the golden quality of the day, flowing around the children over Mrs. Whatsit, over the mountain peak. "Now we will turn around," Mrs. Whatsit said, and the quality of her voice, Meg was afraid again. But when they turned, she saw nothing. Ahead of them was a thin, clear blue of sky. Below them, rocks thrusting out of the shifting sea of white clouds. "Now we wait," Mrs. Whatsit said, "for sunset and moonset. The real head comes tomorrow, but I'll be ready now." I'm glad to hear that. Oliver and Kiwi, my annoying but lovable cats. Oh, those are such cute names. Such cute names. Yep, they are waiting for sunset and moonset. Almost as she spoke, the light began to deepen, to darken. "I want to watch the moonset," Charles Wallace said. "No, child. Do not turn around. Any of you. Face out towards the dark. What I have to show you will be more visible then. Look ahead. Straight ahead. As far as you can possibly look." Now we have to wait more than a year to reach... what is that? 1, 2, 3... a million? Jeez, that's a lot. Yeah, that'll be a long time off. That'll be a long time off. Where was I? Oh, yes. As far as you can possibly look. Meg's eyes ached from the strain of looking and seeing nothing. Then, above the clouds, which encircled the mountain, she seemed to see a shadow, faint thing, of darkness so far off that she was scarcely sure what she was seeing. Charles Wallace said, "What's that?" "That sort of shadow out there," Calvin gestured. "What is it? I don't like it." It's actually 100,000. I counted the zeros before sending. 1, 2, 3. Oh, yeah. I was adding an extra zero mentally, but that's fair. I would think hitting 10,000 would be the next one, though. Where were we? Yes. "What is it?" "I don't like it." "Watch," said Mrs. Whatsit. It was a shadow. Nothing but a shadow. It was not even tangible as a cloud. Was it cast by something? Or was it a thing in itself? Excuse me. The sky darkened. The gold left the light, and they were surrounded by blue, blue deepening until where there had been nothing but the evening sky was now a faint pulse of a star. Then another. Then another. And another. There were more stars than Meg had ever seen before. "The atmosphere is so thin here," Mrs. Whatsit said, as though in answer to her unasked question, "that it does not obscure your vision as it would at home. Now look. Look straight ahead." Nothing is better than burning a bridge down to the water, much like Snack Bomb being a lewd noodle as ever further. I see. All Lamia are now lewd noodles to me. I see. I don't get the analogy or possible metaphor, but alright. I am confused and concerned. Anyways. Meg looked. The dark shadow was still there. It had not lessened or dispersed with the coming of night, and where the shadow was, the stars were not visible. What could there be about a shadow that was so terrible that she knew that there had never been before or ever would be again Anything that would chill her with a fear that was way beyond shuddering, beyond crying or screaming, beyond the possibility of comfort? Meg's hand, holding the blossom, slowly dropped, and it seemed as though a knife gashed through her lungs. She gasped, but there was no air for her to breathe. Darkness glazed her eyes and her mind, but as she started to fall into unconsciousness, her head dropped down into the flowers, which she was still clutching, and as she inhaled the fragrance of their purity, her mind and body revived as she sat up again. Oh gosh, heavy. It's okay, my Zoodle. Just let the sneakers freeze. Thank you for the hydrate story. The shadow was still there, dark and dreadful. Calvin held her hand strongly in his, but she felt neither strength nor reassurance in his touch. Besides her, a tremor went through Charles Wallace, but he sat very much still. He shouldn't be seeing this, Meg thought. This is too much for a little boy, no matter how different and extraordinary a little boy. Calvin turned, rejected the dark thing that blotted out the light of the stars. "Make it go away, Mrs. Whatsit," he whispered. "Make it go away. It's evil." Slowly, the great creature turned around so that the shadow was behind them, so that they only saw the stars obscured. The soft throb of starlight on the mountain, the descending circle of the great moon, swiftly slipping over the horizon. Then, without a word from Mrs. Whatsit, they were traveling downwards, down, down. When they reached the corona of the clouds, Mrs. Whatsit said, "You can breathe without the flowers now, my children." Silence again, not a word. It was as though the shadow had somehow reached out with its dark power and touched them so that they were incapable of speech. When they got back to the flowery field, bathed now in sunlight and moonlight from another, smaller, yellower, rising moon, a little of the tenseness went out of their bodies, and they realized that the body of the beautiful creature on which they had rode had been as rigid as theirs. Zoodle, confused noises? There's a clip. There is a clip that Heavy is referencing. With a graceful gesture, it dropped to the ground and folded its great wings. Charles Wallace was the first to slide off. "Mrs. Who? Mrs. Which?" he called. There was immediate quivering in the air. Mrs. Who's familiar glasses gleamed at them. Mrs. Which appeared too, but, as she had told the children, it was difficult for her to materialize completely. And though there was the robe and peaked hat, Meg could look through them to the mountains and stars. She slid off Mrs. Whatsit's back and walked rather unsteadily after the long ride over to Mrs. Which. "The dark thing we saw," she said. "Is that what my father is fighting?" End of chapter 4. May I get it through whispers, please? You should be able to find it on the TikTok or the YouTube Shorts page. But, yes. So that was the end of chapter 4. And it's taken us about 2 hours. Okay, so it takes us about an hour to read 2 chapters. Which means we'll be here for about 6. About 6 hours reading. Fun. Alright. Oop, that's not it. I did say that it would take about 6.5 hours on Saturday? Did you? I thought you were talking about a game. I don't remember. Anyways, Chapter 5. The Tesseract. "Yes," Mrs. Witch said. "He is behind the darkness, so that even we cannot see him." Meg began to cry, to sob aloud. Through her tears she could see Charles Wallace standing there, very small, very white. Calvin put his arms around her, but she shuddered and broke away, sobbing wildly. Then she was enfolded in the great wings of Mrs. Whatsit, and she felt comfort and strength pouring through her. Mrs. Whatsit was not speaking aloud. Yet, through the wings, Meg understood words. "My child, do not despair. Do you think we would have brought you here if there was no hope? We are asking you to do a difficult thing, but we are confident that you can do it. Your father needs help. He needs courage, and for his children, he may be able to do what he cannot do for himself. Yeah, I bounced from topic to topic, so there's much to happen. Fair enough. Now, Mrs. Witch said, are we ready? Where are we going? Calvin asked. Wait, did I skip anything? I don't think I skipped anything. Anyways. Again, Meg felt an actual physical tingling of fear as Mrs. Witch spoke. We must go behind the shadow. But we will not do it all at once, Mrs. Witch confronted them. We will do it in short stages. She looked at Meg. Now we will test her. We will wrinkle again. Do you understand? No, Meg said flatly. Mrs. Whatsit sighed. Explanations are not easy when they are about things for which your civilization still has no words. Calvin talked about traveling at the speed of light. You understand that, little Meg? Yes, Meg nodded. That, of course, is the impractical long way around. We have learned to take shortcuts wherever possible. Sort of like in math? Meg asked. Like in math, Mrs. Whatsit looked over at Mrs. Who. Take your skirt and show them how. Experience is the mother of knowledge. Mrs. Who took a portion of her white robe in her hands and held it tight. You see, Mrs. Whatsit said, if a very small insect were to move from this section of skirt in Mrs. Who's right hand to that in her left, it would be quite a long walk for him if he had to walk straight across. Swiftly, Mrs. Who brought her hands, still holding the skirt, together. Now, you see, Mrs. Whatsit, he would be there without that long trip. That is how we travel. Charles Wallace accepted the explanation serenely. Even Calvin did not seem perturbed. Oh dear, Meg sighed. I guess I am a moron. I just don't get it. That is because you think of space only in 3 dimensions, Mrs. Whatsit told her. We travel in the 5th. This is something you can understand, Meg. Don't be afraid to try. Was your mother able to explain a tesseract to you? Well, she never did, Meg said. She got so upset about it. Why, Mrs. Whatsit? She said it had something to do with her and Father. It was a concept they were playing with, Mrs. Whatsit said, going beyond the 4th dimension to the 5th. Did your mother explain it to you, Charles? Well, yes. Charles looked a little embarrassed. Please don't be hurt, Meg. I just kept at her while you were at school till I got it out of her. Meg sighed. Just explain it to me. Okay, Charles said. What is the 1st dimension? Well, a line. And the 2nd? Well, you'd square the line. A flat square would be in the 2nd dimension. And the 3rd? Well, you'd square the 2nd dimension. Then the square wouldn't be flat anymore. It would have a bottom and sides and a top. And the 4th? Well, I guess if you want to put it into mathematical terms, you'd square the square. But you can't take a pencil and draw it in the way that the first 3. So I know it's got to do something with Einstein and time. I guess maybe you could call the 4th dimension time. That's right, Charles said. Good girl. Okay then, for the 5th dimension you'd square the 4th, wouldn't you? I guess so. Well, the 5th dimension's a tesseract. You add that to the other 4 dimensions, and you can travel through space without having to go the long way around. In other words, to put it into Euclid, or old-fashioned plane geometry, a straight line is not the shortest distance between 2 points. For a brief, illuminating second, Meg's face had the listening, probing expression that was so often seen on Charles. I see, she cried. I got it. For just a moment, I got it. I can't possibly explain it now, but there for a second I saw it. She turned excitedly to Calvin. Did you get it? He nodded. Enough. I don't understand it the way Charles Wallace does, but enough to get the idea. So now we go, Mrs. Witch said. There is not all the time in the world. Could we hold hands? Meg asked. Calvin took her hand and held it tightly in his. You can try, Mrs. Whatsit said, though I'm not sure how it will work. You see, though we travel together, we travel alone. We will go first and take you afterwards in the backwash. Backwash. That may be easier for you. As she spoke, the great white body began to waver, the wings to dissolve into mist. Mrs. Who seemed to evaporate until there was nothing but the glasses. Then the glasses too disappeared. It reminded Meg of the Cheshire Cat. Call back to the previous reading stream. I've often seen a face without glasses, she thought, but glasses without a face? I wonder if I go that way too. First me, then my glasses. That is a good question there, Meg. She looked over at Mrs. Witch. Mrs. Witch was there, and then she wasn't. There was a gust of wind. Mama, when you... What? Were you tired drunk that... Oh, were you tired drunk that night? I mean, is so tired that you talking nonsense? Last reading stream? I was getting tongue-tied, but no, I wasn't tired drunk. Not at that point. Let's see. Where were we? Oh, yes. She looked over at Mrs. Witch. Mrs. Witch was there, and then she wasn't. There was a gust of wind and a great thrust and a sharp shattering as she was shoved through what? Through what? Then darkness, silence, nothingness. Calvin was still holding her hand, she could not feel it, but this time she was prepared for the sudden and complete dissolution of her body. When she felt the tingling come back to her fingertips, she knew that this journey was almost over, and she could feel again the pressure of Calvin's hand around hers. Without warning, coming as complete and utter unexpected shock. No, last stream, Stardew Saturday. I don't know. No, that one was fine. I think the clip that you're talking about, if you're talking about the lullaby clip, that was from a couple of streams ago. Without warning, coming as a complete and unexpected shock, she felt a pressure she had never imagined, as though she was being completely flattened out by an enormous steamroller. This was far worse than the nothingness had been. While she was nothing, there was no need to breathe, for now her lungs were squeezed together so that she could... my goodness, I'm messing this up. So that although she was dying for want of air, there was no way for her lungs to expand and contract to take in the air that she must have to stay alive. This was completely different from the thinning of atmosphere when they flew up the mountain, and she had to put the flowers to her face to breathe. She tried to gasp, but a paper doll cannot gasp. She thought she was trying to think, but her flattened-out mind was unable to function as her lungs. Her thoughts were squashed along with the rest of her. Her heart tried to beat. It gave knife-like, sideways movement, but it could not expand. Also I found that you can buy Stardew Valley on mobile for $5. What a fucking steal. Fair enough, fair enough. Probably was sleeping when that happened. Understandable then. Where was I? Here we are. But then she seemed to hear a voice. Or if not a voice, at least words. Words flattened out like printed words on paper. Oh no, we can't stop here. This is a two-dimensional planet, and the children can't manage here. She was whizzed into nothingness again, and nothingness was wonderful. She did not mind that she could not feel Calvin's hand, that she could not see or feel or be. The relief from the intolerable pressure was all she needed. Then the tingling came back to her fingers, her toes. She could feel Calvin holding her tightly. Her heart beat regularly, blood coursing through her veins. Whatever had happened, whatever mistake had been made, it was over now. She thought she heard Charles Wallace saying, his words round and full as spoken words ought to be. Really, Mrs. Witch, you might have killed us. This time she was pushed out of the frightening fifth dimension with a sudden, immediate jerk, and there she was, herself again, standing with Calvin beside her, holding onto her hand for dear life. Charles Wallace in front of her, looking indignant. Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch were not visible, but she knew they were there. The fact of their presence was strong about her. "Children, I apologize," came Mrs. Witch's voice. "Now, Charles, calm down," Mrs. Whatsit said, appearing not as the great and beautiful beast she had been when they last saw her, but in the familiar wild garb of shawls and scarves and the old tramp's coat and hat. "You know how difficult it is for her to materialize. If you are not substantial yourself, it's very difficult to realize how limiting protoplasm is." "I am sorry," Mrs. Witch's voice came again, but there was more than a hint of amusement in it. "It is not funny." Charles Wallace gave a childish stamp of his foot. Mrs. Who's glasses shone out, and the rest of her appeared more slowly behind them. We are such stuff as dreams are made of." She smiled broadly. Prospero in The Tempest, I do like that play. You didn't do it on purpose, Charles demanded. Oh, my darling, of course not, Mrs. Whatsit said quickly. It was just a very understandable mistake. It's very difficult for Mrs. Witch to think in a corporeal way. She wouldn't hurt you deliberately, you know that. And it's really a little pleasant little planet, and rather amusing to be flat. We always enjoy our visits there. Where are we now, then? Charles Wallace demanded. And why? In Orion's Belt. We have a friend here, and we want you to have a look at your own planet. When are we going home? Meg asked anxiously. What about Mother? What about the twins? They'll be terribly worried about us. The Tempest? I'm assuming that's a play, considering I do like that play. But, not sure. I've never seen it. And what about the twins? They'll be terribly worried about us when we didn't come in at bedtime. Well, Mother must be frantic by now. She and the twins in Fort will have been looking and looking for us, and of course we aren't there to be found. No, I thought I escaped Shakespeare here. Oh gosh. Keep losing my place. Now, don't worry, my pet, Mrs. Whatsit said cheerfully. We took care of that before we left. Your mother has had enough to worry about, or has enough to worry her with you and Charles to cope with, and not knowing about your father without adding to her anxieties. We took a time wrinkle as well as a space wrinkle. It's very easy to do if you just know how. What do you mean? Meg asked plaintively. Please, Mrs. Whatsit, it's all so confusing. Just relax and don't worry over things that don't need to that needn't trouble you, Mrs. Whatsit said. Made a nice tidy little time tesser, and unless something goes terribly wrong, we'll have you back about 5 minutes before you left, so there'll be time to spare and nobody'll ever need to know you were gone at all. Though, of course, you'll be telling your mother, dear lamb that she is. And if something goes terribly wrong, it won't matter whether we ever came back at all. Don't frighten them, Mrs. Witch's voice came. Are you losing faith? Oh no, no I'm not. But Meg thought her voice sounded a little faint. I hope this is a nice planet. Calvin said, we can't see much of it. Does it ever clear up? Meg looked around her and realized that she had been so breathless from the journey and then the stop on the two-dimensional planet that she had not noticed her surroundings. And perhaps this was not very surprising, for the main thing about her surroundings was that they were exactly that they were unnoticeable. They seemed to be standing on some kind of nondescript flat surface. The air around them was gray. It's not exactly fog, but she could see nothing through it. Visibility was limited to the nicely definite bodies of Charles Wallace and Calvin, the rather unbelievable bodies of Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who, and a faint occasional glimmer that was Mrs. Witch. Come, children, Mrs. Whatsit said. We don't have far to go, and we might as well walk. It will do you good to stretch your legs a little. As they moved through the grayness, Meg caught an occasional glimpse of slag-like rocks. There were no traces of trees or bushes, nothing but flat ground under their feet, no sign of any vegetation at all. Finally, ahead of them loomed what seemed to be a hill of stone. As they approached it, Meg could see that there was an entrance that led into a deep, dark cavern. Are we going in there? She asked nervously. Don't be afraid, Mrs. Whatsit said. It's easier for the happy medium to work within. Oh, you'll like her, children. She's very jolly. If I ever saw her looking unhappy, I would be very depressed myself. As long as she can laugh, I'm sure everything is going to come out right in the end. Mrs. Whatsit, came Mrs. Witch's voice severely. Just because you are young is no excuse for talking too much. Mrs. Whatsit looked hurt, but she subsided. Just how old are you? Calvin asked her. Just a moment, Mrs. Whatsit murmured, and appeared to calculate rapidly upon her fingers. She nodded triumphantly. Exactly 2,379,152,497 years, 8 months, and 3 days. That is, according to your calendar, of course, which even you know isn't very accurate. She leaned closer to Meg and Calvin and whispered, I was really a very good honor. It was really a very good honor for me to be chosen for this mission. It's just because of my verbalizing and materializing so well, you know? But of course, we can't take any credit for our talents. It's how we use them that counts. And I make far too many mistakes. That's why Mrs. Who and I enjoy seeing Mrs. What... I am getting tongue-tied over here. Mrs. Witch make a mistake when she tried to land you two on a two-dimensional planet. It was that we were laughing at, not at you. What kind of vampire anime logic is this? Not sure. It's explained in the other books, though. Yes, there's 4 other books. No, I will not be reading them on stream. Where were we? She was laughing at herself, you see. She's really terribly nice to us younger ones. The age, I need the rules. Fair enough. Meg was listening with such interest to what Mrs. Whatsit was saying that she hardly noticed when they went into the cave. Transition from the grayness of outside to the grayness of inside was almost unnoticeable. She saw a flickering light ahead of them, ahead and down, and it was towards this that they went. As they drew closer, she realized that it was a fire. It gets very cold in here, Mrs. Whatsit said, so we asked her to have a good bonfire going for you. As they approached the fire, they could see a dark shadow against it. And as they went closer still, they could see that the shadow was a woman. She wore a turban of beautiful pale mauve silk, and a long flowing purple satin gown. It's a gown. In her hands was a crystal ball into which she was gazing raptly. She did not appear to see the children, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, or Mrs. Witch, but continued staring into the crystal ball. As she began to laugh, and she laughed and laughed at whatever it was that she was seeing. Mrs. Witch's voice rang out clear and strong, echoing against the walls of the cavern, and the words fell with a sonorous clang. "We are here!" The woman looked up from the ball, and when she saw them, she got up, curtsied deeply. Jeez. Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who dropped small curtsies in return, and the shimmer seemed to bow slightly. "Oh, medium dear," Mrs. Whatsit said. "These are the children. Charles Wallace bowed. Margaret Murray. Meg felt that if Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who had curtsied, she ought to also, and she did, rather awkwardly. And Calvin O'Keefe. Calvin bobbed his head. "We want them to see their home planet," Mrs. Whatsit said. The medium lost the delighted smile she had worn until then. "Oh, why must you make me look at the unpleasant things when there are so many delightful ones to see?" Again, Mrs. Witch's voice reverberated through the cave. "There will no longer be so many pleasant things to look at if responsible people do not do something about the unpleasant ones." The medium sighed and held the ball high. "Look, children," Mrs. Whatsit said. "Look into it well. How small is the earth to him who looks from heaven." "Dilial?" Mrs. Who intoned musically. Meg looked into the crystal ball, at first with caution, then with increasing eagerness, as she seemed to see an enormous sweep of dark and empty space, and then galaxies swinging across it. Finally, they seemed to move in one of the galaxies. "Your own Milky Way," said Mrs. Whatsit whispered to Meg. They were headed directly towards the center of the galaxy, then moved off to one side. Stars seemed to be rushing at them. Meg flung up her arms over her face as though to ward off the blow. "Look," Mrs. Witch commanded. Meg dropped her arms. They seemed to be moving in towards a planet. She thought she could make out polar ice caps. Everything seemed sparkling clear. "No, medium dear, that's Mars," Mrs. Whatsit reproved gently. "Do I have to... Can I paste a whole song in chat?" What do you mean by that, Ruby? Also, welcome into chat. Do you mean paste the lyrics? If so, go right ahead, but if you mean a link, then Twitch would probably yell at you. Ah, I see. So I'd say no to that. Yeah, no, I would say no to that. Yeah, anyways, where was I? Ah. Do I have to? The medium asked. Now, Mrs. Whatsit commanded. The bright planet moved out of their vision. For a moment there was a darkness of space, then another planet. The outlines of this planet were not clean and clear. It seemed to be covered with a smoky haze. Through the haze, Meg thought she could make out familiar outlines of continents like pictures in her social studies books. Is it because of our atmosphere that we cannot see it properly? She asked anxiously. No, Meg. You know that it is not the atmosphere, Mrs. Witch said. You must be brave. It's the thing, Charles Wallace cried. It's the dark thing we saw from the mountain peak on Uriel when we were riding on Mrs. Whatsit's back. Did it just come? Meg asked in agony, unable to take her eyes from the sickness of the shadow which darkened the beauty of the earth. Did it just come while we've been gone? Mrs. Witch's voice seemed very tired. Tell her, she said to Mrs. Whatsit. Mrs. Whatsit sighed. No, Meg, it hasn't just come. It's been there for a great many years. That's why your planet is such a troubled one. But why? Calvin started to ask. His voice croaked hoarsely. Mrs. Whatsit raised her hand to silence him. We showed you the dark thing on Uriel first. Oh, for many reasons. First, because the atmosphere on the planet, on the mountain peaks there is so clear and thin you could see it for what it is. Where was I? Oh, I lost my spot. You can see it for what it is. And we thought it would be easier for you to understand if you saw it, well, someplace else first, not on your own Earth. I hate it, Charles Wallace cried passionately. I hate the dark thing. Mrs. Whatsit nodded. Yes, Charles dear, we all do. There's another reason we wanted to prepare you on Uriel. We thought it would be too frightening for you to see it first of all on your own beloved world. But what is it? Calvin demanded. We know that it's evil, but what is it? You have said it, Mrs. Witch's voice rang out. It is evil. It is the powers of darkness. But what's going to happen? Meg's voice trembled. Oh, please, Mrs. Witch, tell us what's going to happen. We will continue to fight. Something in Mrs. Witch's voice made all three of the children stand straighter, throwing back their shoulders with determination, looking at the glimmer that was Mrs. Witch with pride and confidence. And we're not alone, you know, children, came Mrs. Whatsit, the comforter. All through the universe it's being fought, all through the cosmos. And but it's a grand and exciting battle. I know it's hard for you to understand about size, how there's very little difference in the size of the tiniest microbe in the greatest galaxy. If you think about that, maybe it won't seem strange to you that some of our very best fighters have come right from your own planet. It's a little planet, dears, out on the edge of a little galaxy. You can be proud it's done so well. Who have our fighters been? Calvin asked. Oh, you must know them, dear, Mrs. Whatsit said triumphantly. No, that's on the next line. I am losing my gosh darn mind. Mrs. Who's spectacles shone at them triumphantly, and the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Jesus, Charles Wallace said. Why, of course, Jesus. Of course, Mrs. Whatsit said. Go on, Charles, love. There were others, all of your great artists. They've been lights for us to see by. Leonardo da Vinci, Calvin suggested tentatively, and Michelangelo, and Shakespeare, Charles Wallace cried out, and Bach, and Pasteur, and Madame Curie, and Einstein. Now Calvin's voice rang with confidence. And Schweitzer, and Gandhi, and Buddha, and Beethoven, and Rembrandt, and St. Francis. Now you, Meg, Mrs. Whatsit ordered. Oh, Euclid, I suppose. Meg was in such agony of impatience that her voice grated irritably. And Copernicus, but what about father? Please, what about father? We are going to your father, Mrs. Witch said. But where is he? Meg went over to Mrs. Witch and stamped as though she was as young as Charles Wallace. Mrs. Whatsit answered in a voice that was low but quite firm. On a planet that has given in. So, you must prepare to be very strong. All traces of cheer had left the happy medium's face. She sat, holding the great ball, looking down at the shadowed earth, and a slow tear coursed down her cheek. I can't stand it any longer, she sobbed. Watch now, children, watch. Alright, and that is the end of chapter 5. Okay. Let's see here. I am getting a little bit tired of reading. My eyes are a little bit unfocusy. So I think we will read one more chapter, but then we'll call it there, and that'll take us to about 3 hours, which will be about the same amount of time that we read for the last book. We'll have to finish reading this book at some other point, but yeah, I think we'll read one more chapter and then we'll end it there. Then we'll go and play a game or something. Because my eyes are not focusing like they should. During Luigi's Mansion? What do you mean by during? I was thinking more during the subathon when we have some downtime, but as one does. Alright. Chapter 6. The Happy Medium. Again they focused their eyes on the crystal ball. The earth, with its fearful covering of dark shadow, swam out of view and then moved rapidly through the Milky Way. And there was the thing again. Watch, the medium told them. The darkness seemed to seethe and writhe. Was this meant to comfort them? Suddenly, there was a great burst of light through the darkness. The light spread out, and where it touched the darkness disappeared. The light spread until the patch of dark thing had vanished, and there was only a gentle shining. And through the shining came the stars, clear and pure. Then slowly, the shining dwindled until it too was gone. And there was nothing but stars and starlight, no shadows, no fear, only the stars in the clear darkness of space, quite different from the fearful darkness of the thing. You see, the medium cried, smiling happily, it can be overcome. It is being overcome all the time. Mrs. Whatsit sighed, a sigh so sad that Meg wanted to put her arms around her and comfort her. Tell us exactly what happened then, please, Charles Wallace said in a small voice. It was a star, Mrs. Whatsit said sadly. A star giving up its life in a battle with the thing. It won! Oh yes, my children, it won. But it lost its life in the winning. Mrs. Whatsit spoke again. Her voice sounded tired, and they knew that speaking was a tremendous amount of effort for her. It was not so long ago for you, was it? She asked gently. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head. Charles Wallace went up to Mrs. Whatsit. I see. Now I understand. You were a star once, weren't you? Mrs. Whatsit covered her face with her hands as though she was embarrassed and nodded. And you did just what that star did. With her face still covered, Mrs. Whatsit nodded again. So there's the age lore there. They were originally stars. Charles Wallace looked at her very solemnly. I should like to kiss you. Alrighty then. Mrs. Whatsit took her hands down from her face and pulled Charles Wallace to her in a quick embrace. He put his arms around her neck, pressed her cheek against hers, and then kissed her. Meg felt that she would have liked to kiss Mrs. Whatsit too, but that after Charles Wallace, anything that she or Calvin did or said would be anticlimax. So they are dwarf stars. I think just stars in general. She contented herself with looking at Mrs. Whatsit, even though she was used to Mrs. Whatsit's odd getup, and the very oddness of it was what made her seem so comforting. She realized that with a fresh shock that it was not Mrs. Whatsit herself that she was seeing at all. The true Mrs. Whatsit, Meg realized, was beyond human understanding. What she saw was only the game Mrs. Whatsit was playing. It was an amusing and charming game, a game full of both laughter and comfort, but it was only the tiniest facet of all the things Mrs. Whatsit could be. I didn't mean to tell you, Mrs. Whatsit faltered. I didn't mean to ever let you know, but oh my dears, I did so love being a star. You are still very young, Mrs. Witch said, her voice faintly chiding. The medium sat looking at the star-filled sky in her ball, smiling and nodding and chuckling gently. But Meg noticed that her eyes were drooping, and suddenly her head fell forward and she gave a faint snore. Poor thing, Mrs. Whatsit said. We've worn her out. It's very hard work for her. Please, Mrs. Whatsit, Meg asked, what happens now? Why are we here? What do we do next? Where is Father? When are we going to him? She clasped her hands pleadingly. One thing at a time, love, Mrs. Whatsit said. Mrs. Who cut in. Walls have ears. In Portuguese, I see. Yes, let's go outside, Mrs. Whatsit said. Come, we'll let her sleep. But as they turned to go, the medium jerked her head up and smiled at them radiantly. You weren't going to go without saying goodbye to me, were you? She asked. We thought we'd just let you sleep, dear, Mrs. Whatsit patted the medium's shoulder. We worked you terribly hard, and we know you must be tired. But I was going to give you some ambrosia, or nectar, or at least some tea. Thank you for the hug here. Thank you, thank you. At this, Meg realized that she was hungry. How much time had passed since they had their last bowls of stew? She wondered. But Mrs. Whatsit said, "Oh, thank you, dear, but I think we'd better be going." "They don't need to eat, you know," Charles Wallace whispered to Meg. "At least not food, the way we do. Eating's just a game to them. As soon as we get organized again, I'd better remind them that they'd have to feed us sooner or later." The medium smiled and nodded. "It does seem as though I should do something nice for you after having to show those poor children such horrid things. Would you like to see their mother before they go?" "Could we see Father?" Meg asked eagerly. "No," Mrs. Witch said. "We are going to your father, Meg. Do not be impatient." "But she could see her mother, couldn't she?" The medium wheeled. "Oh, why not?" Mrs. Whatsit put in. "It won't take long and it won't do any harm. And Calvin too? Could he see his mother too?" Calvin touched Meg in a quick gesture. Whether it was of thanks or apprehension, she was not sure. "I think it is a mistake," Mrs. Witch said disapprovingly. "But, since you have mentioned it, I suppose you should go ahead." "I hate it when she gets cross," Mrs. Whatsit said, glancing over at Mrs. Witch, "and the trouble is she always seems to be right. But I really don't see how it could hurt, and it might make you all feel better. Go on, medium dear." The medium, smiling and humming softly, turned the crystal ball a little between her hands. Stars, comets, planets flashed across the sky, and then the Earth came into view again. The darkened Earth, closer and closer till it filled the globe. And then they were somehow gone through the darkness until the soft white of clouds and gentle outline of continents shone clearly. "Calvin's mother first," Meg whispered to the medium. The globe became hazy, cloudy, then shadows began to solidify, to clarify. They were looking into an untidy kitchen with a sink full of unwashed dishes. In front of the sink stood an unkempt woman with gray hair stringing about her face. Her mouth was open and Meg could see the toothless gums, and it seemed that she could almost hear her screaming at the two small children who were standing by her. Then she grabbed a long wooden spoon from the sink and began whacking one of the children. "Oh dear," the medium murmured, and the picture began to dissolve. "I didn't really—" "It's all right," Calvin said in a low voice. "I think I'd rather you knew." Now, instead of reaching out to Calvin for safety, Meg took his hand in hers, not saying anything in words, but trying to tell him by the pressure of her fingers what she felt. If anyone had told her only the day before that she, Meg, the snaggletooth, the myopic, the clumsy, would be taking a boy's hand to offer him comfort and strength, particularly a popular and important boy like Calvin, the idea would have been beyond her comprehension. But now it seemed as natural to want to help and protect Calvin as it did Charles Wallace. The shadows were swirling in the crystal again, and as they cleared, Meg began to recognize her mother's lab at home. Mrs. Murray was sitting perched on her high stool, writing away at a sheet of paper on a clipboard on her lap. "She's writing Father," thought Meg, the way she always does. Every night. The tears that she could never learn to control swam to her eyes, and she watched. Mrs. Murray looked up from her letter, almost as though she were looking up towards the children, and let her head drop back down as she put it down on the paper and sat there, huddled up, letting herself relax in the unhappiness that she never allowed her children to see. "Liking the reading? I'm glad to hear that." "I am glad to hear you are liking it." Where were we? Ah, yes. And now the desire for tears left Meg's. Meg, not Meg's. Jeez. The hot, protective anger that she had felt for Calvin when she looked into his home, she now felt turned towards her mother. "Let's go," she cried harshly. "Let's do something." "She's always so right," Mrs. Whatsit murmured, looking towards Miss Witch. "Sometimes I wish she'd just say, 'I told you so,' and have done with it." "I only meant to help," the medium wailed. "Oh, medium dear, don't feel badly," Mrs. Whatsit said swiftly. "Look at something cheerful." "Do. I can't bear to have you distressed." "It's all right," Meg assured the medium earnestly. "Truly it is, Mrs. Medium, and we thank you very much." "Are you sure?" the medium asked, brightening. "Of course. It really helped ever so much, because it made me mad, and when I'm mad, I don't have room to be scared." "Well, kiss me goodbye for luck then," the medium said. Meg went over to her and gave her a quick kiss, and so did Charles Wallace. The medium looked smilingly at Calvin and winked. "Want the young man to kiss me too. I always did love red hair." "I'll give you good luck, laddie me love." "I see. Okay then." Calvin bent down, blushing, and awkwardly kissed her cheek. The medium tweaked his nose. "You've got a lot to learn, my boy," she told him. "Now, goodbye, medium dear, and many thanks," Mrs. Whatsit said. "I dare say we'll see you in an eon or two." "Where are you going in case I want to tune in?" the medium asked. Kamazat's, I think, Mrs. Whatsit told her. Where and what's was Kamazat's? Meg did not like the sound of the word or the way in which Mrs. Whatsit pronounced it, but please don't distress yourself on our behalf. You know you don't like looking in on the dark planets, and it's very upsetting to us when you aren't happy. But I must know what happens to the children, the medium said. It's my worst trouble, getting fond. If I didn't get fond, I could be happy all the time. Oh well, ho-hum. I manage to keep pretty jolly, and a little snooze will do wonders for me right now. Goodbye, And her word got lost in the general bzzz of a snore. "Come," Mrs. Whatsit ordered, and they followed her out of the darkness of the cave to the impersonal grayness of the medium's planet. "Now, children, you must not be frightened at what is going to happen," Mrs. Witch warned. "Stay angry, little Meg," Mrs. Whatsit whispered. "You will need all your anger now." Without warning, Meg was swept up into nothingness again. This time, the nothingness was interrupted by a feeling of clammy coldness, such as those she had never felt before. The coldness deepened and swirled all around her and through her, and was filled with a new and strange kind of darkness that was completely tangible thing, a thing that wanted to eat and digest her like some sort of malignant beast of prey. The darkness was gone. Had it been the shadow, the black thing? Had they had to travel through it to get to her father? There was the by now familiar tingling in her hands and feet and the push through the hardness. She was on her feet, breathless but unharmed, standing beside Calvin and Charles Wallace. Is this Kamazat? How the fuck did I pronounce this? Kamazats? Charles Wallace asked as Mrs. Whatsit materialized in front of him. Yes, she answered. Now let's just stand and get our breath and look around. They were standing on a hill, and as Meg looked about her home, she felt it could be easily a hill on Earth. There were the familiar trees she knew so well at home, birches, pines, maples, and though it was warmer than it had been when they so precipitously left the apple orchard, there was a faintly autumnal touch to the air. Near them were several small trees, which reddened, leaved like sumac, and the big patch of the goldenrod like flowers.
Thank you for the follow. Welcome to the Cult of the Snake, Mom.
I see your name there. I only follow bottoms. How are you doing? I hope everyone's having a good day/night. I hope you're doing well as well. We are currently reading the last chapter that we're going to read tonight of A Wrinkle in Time. So soon we'll probably be switching to Stardew. But hopefully you enjoy your stay here, and I hope you enjoy the cozy vibes. Alright. Oh, thank you for the hydrate. Thank you, thank you. Where were we? Ah, yes. As she looked down the hill, she could see the smokestacks of a town, and it might have been any number of familiar towns. There seemed to be nothing strange or different or frightening in the landscape, but Mrs. Whatsit came to her and put an arm around her comfortingly. I can't stay with you here, you know, love. You three children will be on your own. We will be near you, we will be watching you, but you will not be able to see us or ask us for help, and we will not be able to come to you. But is Father here? Meg asked tremblingly. Yes, but where? When will we see him? She was poised for running, as though she was going to sprint off immediately to wherever her father was. That I cannot tell you. You will just have to wait until the next proprietous meeting. Moment. Not meeting. Brain. Come on. Words. Charles Wallace looked steadily at Mrs. Whatsit. Are you afraid for us? A little. But if you weren't afraid to do what you did when you were a star, why should you be afraid for us now? But I was afraid, Mrs. Whatsit said gently. She looked steadily at each of the three children in turn. You will need help, she told them, but all I am allowed to give you is a little talisman. Calvin, your great gift is your ability to communicate with all kinds of people. So for you, I will strengthen this gift. Meg, I give you your faults. My faults? Meg cried. Your faults. But I'm always trying to get rid of my faults. Yes, Mrs. Whatsit said. However, I think you'll find they'll come in handy Kamazats, I think. I don't know. I'm gonna butcher that. Charles Wallace, to you I give the resilience of your childhood. From somewhere, Mrs. Who's glasses glimmered and they could hear her voice. Calvin, she said, a hint. For you a hint. Listen well. For that he was a spirit too delicate to act their earthly and abhorred commands, refusing their grand hests did they confine him. By help of their most potent ministers and in their unmitigable rage, into a cloven pine, within which rift imprisoned he didst painfully remain. And that's from The Tempest. I'm sorry, Aqua. Where are you, Mrs. Who? Charles Wallace asked. Where is Mrs. Witch? We cannot come to you now, Mrs. Who's voice blew to them like the wind. I do not know everything, still I know many things, or still many things I understand. That is for you, Charles. Remember that you do not know everything. Then the voice was directed to Meg. To you I leave my glasses, little blind as a bat, but do not use them except as a last resort. Save them for the final moment of peril. As she spoke, there was another shimmer of spectacles. And then it was gone, and the voice faded out with it. The spectacles were in Meg's hands. What happened? Another Shakespearean text got mentioned? Yeah, there was a direct quote from The Tempest again. The spectacles were in Meg's hand. She put them carefully into the breast pocket of her blazer, and the knowledge that they were there somehow made her a little less afraid. To all three of you I give my command, Mrs. Witch said. Go down into the town. Go together. Do not let them separate you. Be strong. There was a flicker, and then it vanished. Meg shivered. Mrs. Whatsit had seen the shiver, for she patted Meg on the shoulder. Then she turned to Calvin. Take care of Meg. I can take care of Meg, Charles Wallace said rather sharply. I always have. Mrs. Whatsit looked at Charles Wallace, and the creaky voice seemed somehow both to soften and to deepen at the same time. Charles Wallace, the danger here is greatest for you. Why? Because of what you are. Just exactly because of what you are. You will be by far the most vulnerable. You must stay with Meg and Calvin. You must not go on your own. Beware of pride and arrogance, Charles, for they may betray you. At the tone of Mrs. Whatsit's voice, both warning and frightening, Meg shivered again, and Charles Wallace butted up against Mrs. Whatsit in the way he often did with his mother, whispering, Now I think I know what you meant about being afraid. Only a fool is not afraid, Mrs. Whatsit told him. Now go. And where she had been, there was only sky and grass and a small rock. Come on, Meg said impatiently. Come on, let's go. She was completely unaware that her voice was trembling like an aspen leaf. She took Charles Wallace and Calvin each by the hand and started down the hill. Below them, the town was laid out in a harsh angular pattern. The houses in the outskirts were all exactly alike, small, square boxes painted gray. Each had a small, rectangular plot of lawn in front with a straight line of dull-looking flowers edging the path to the door. Meg had a feeling that if she could count the flowers that they would be exactly the same number for each house. In front of all the houses, children were playing. Some were skipping rope, some were bouncing balls. Meg felt vaguely that something was wrong with their play. It seemed exactly like children playing around any housing development at home, and yet there was something different about it. She looked at Calvin, and saw that he too was puzzled. Look, Charles Wallace said suddenly. They're skipping and bouncing in rhythm. Everyone's doing it at the exact same moment. This was so. As the skipping rope hit the pavement, so did the ball. As the rope curved up to the head of the jumping child, the child with the ball caught the ball. Down came the ropes, down came the balls. Up and over again. Up, down, all in rhythm, all identical. Like the houses, like the paths, like the flowers. Then the doors of all the houses opened simultaneously, and out came a woman like a row of paper dolls. Or out came women like a row of paper dolls. The print on their dresses was different, but they all gave the appearance of being the same. Each woman stood on the steps of her house. Each clapped. Each child with the ball caught the ball. Each child with the skipping rope folded the rope. Each child turned and walked into the house. The doors clicked shut behind them. How can they do it? Meg asked wonderingly. We couldn't do it that way if we tried. What does it mean? Let's go back. Calvin's voice was urgent. Back? Charles Wallace asked. Where? I don't know. Anywhere. Back to the hill. Back to Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who and Mrs. Which. Don't like this. Or, I don't like this, but the eye is off screen. It's fine. But they aren't there. Do you think they'd come to us if we turn back now? I don't like it, Calvin said again. Come on. Impatience made Meg squeak. You know we can't go back. Mrs. Whatsit said to go into the town. She started down the street, and the two boys followed her. The houses, all identical, continued as far as the eye could reach. Then, all at once, they saw the same thing and stopped to watch. In front of one of the houses stood a little boy with a ball, and he was bouncing it. But he bounced it rather badly, and with no particular rhythm, sometimes dropping it and running after it with awkward, furtive leaps, sometimes throwing it up into the air and trying to catch it. The door of his house opened and out ran one of the mother figures. She looked wildly up and down the street, saw the children, and put her hand to her mouth as though to stifle a scream, grabbed the little boy and rushed indoors with him. The ball dropped from his fingers and rolled out into the street. Charles Wallace ran after it and picked it up, holding it up for Meg and Calvin to see. It seemed like a perfectly ordinary brown rubber ball. Let's take it to him and see what happens, Charles Wallace suggested. Meg pulled at him. Mrs. Whatsit said for us to go on into the town. Well, we are in the town, aren't we? The outskirts, anyhow. I want to know more about this. I have a hunch it may help us later. You go on if you don't want to come with me. No, said Calvin firmly. We're going to stay together. Mrs. Whatsit said we aren't to let them separate us. But I'm with you on this. Let's knock and see what happens. They went up the path to the house. Meg, reluctant, eager to get into the town. Let's hurry, she begged. Please, don't you want to find Father? Yes, Charles Wallace said, but not blindly. How can we help him if we don't know what we're up against? And it's obvious we've been brought here to help him, not just to find him. He walked briskly up the steps and knocked on the door, and they waited. Nothing happened. Then Charles Wallace saw a bell, and he rang. He could hear the bell buzzing in the house, and the sound of it echoed down the street. After a moment, the mother figure opened the door. All up and down the street, other doors opened, but only a crack, and eyes peered towards the three children and the woman looking fearfully out the door. What do you want? She asked. It isn't paper time yet. We've had milk time. We've had this month's puller prush person, and I've given my decency donations regularly. All my papers are in order. I think your little boy dropped his ball, Charles Wallace said, holding it out. The woman pushed the ball away. Oh no, the children in our section never drop balls. They're all perfectly trained. We haven't had an aberration for 3 years. All up and down the block, heads nodded in agreement. Charles Wallace moved closer to the woman and looked past her into the house. Behind her in the shadows he could see the little boy, who must have been around his own age. You can't come in, the woman said. You haven't shown me any papers. I don't have to let you in if you don't have any papers. Charles Wallace held the ball out beyond the woman so the little boy could see it. Quick as a flash, the boy leapt up, grabbed the ball from Charles Wallace's hand, then darted back into the shadow. The woman went very white, opened her mouth as though to say something, then slammed the door in their faces instead. All up and down the street, all up and down the street door slammed. What are they afraid of? Charles Wallace asked. What's the matter with them? Don't you know? Meg asked him. Don't you know what all this is about, Charles? Not yet, Charles Wallace said. Not even an inkling. But I'm trying. But I didn't get through anywhere, not even a chink. Let's go. He stumped down the steps. After several blocks, the houses gave way to apartment buildings. At least Meg felt sure that was what they must be. They were fairly tall buildings, rectangular, absolutely plain, each window, each entrance exactly like the other. Then coming toward them down the street was a boy about Calvin's age, riding a machine that was something like a combination of a bicycle and a motorcycle. Had the slimness and lightness of a bicycle, yet as the foot pedals turned they seemed to generate an unseen source of power, so that the boy could pedal very slowly and yet move along the street quite swiftly. As he reached each entrance, he thrust one hand into a bag he wore slung on his shoulder and pulled out a roll of papers and tossed it into the entrance. Might have been Dennis, or Sandy, or any one of the 100 boys with the newspaper route in any one of the 100 towns back home, and yet, as with the children playing ball and jumping rope, there was something wrong about it. The rhythm of the gesture never varied. The paper flew in identically the same arc, at each doorway and landed in identically the same spot. It was impossible for anyone to throw with such consistent perfection. Calvin whistled. I wonder if they play baseball here. As the boy saw them, he slowed down on his machine and he stopped, his hand arrested as it was about to plunge in the bag. What are you kids doing out on the street? He demanded. Only route boys are allowed out. Now, you know that. No, we don't know that, Charles Wallace said. We're strangers here. How about telling us something about this place? You mean you've had your entrance papers processed and everything? The boy asked. You must have if you're here, he answered himself. And what are you doing here if you don't know about us? You tell me, Charles Wallace said. Are you examiners? The little boy asked anxiously. Everyone knows our city has the best central intelligence center on the planet. Our production levels are the highest. Our factories never close. Our machines never stop rolling. Added to this, we have 5 poets, 1 musician, 3 artists, and 6 sculptors, all perfectly channeled. What are you quoting from? Charles Wallace asked. The manual, of course, the boy said. We are the most oriented city on the planet. There has been no trouble of any kind for centuries. All of Camazotz knows our record. That's why we are the capital city of Camazotz. That is why Central City Intelligence is located here. And that's why it makes its home here. It is capitalized. There was something about the way he said it that made a shiver run up and down Meg's spine. Charles Wallace asked briskly, Where's the Central Intelligence Center of yours? Central City, the boys corrected. Just keep going and you can't miss it. You are strangers, aren't you? What are you doing here? Are you supposed to be asking questions? Charles Wallace demanded severely. The boy went white, just as the woman had. I humbly beg your pardon. I must continue my route now, or I will have to talk my timing into the explainer. He shot off down the street on his machine. Charles Wallace stared after him. What is it? He asked Meg and Calvin. There was something funny about the way he talked as well. He talked, as though he didn't really like doing the talking. Know what I mean? Calvin nodded thoughtfully. Funny is right. Funny peculiar. Not only the way he talked either. The whole thing smells. Come on, Meg pulled at them. How many times was it she had urged them on? Let's go find Father. He'll be able to explain it all to us. They walked on. After several more blocks, they began to see other people. Grown-up people, not children, walking up and down the street. These people ignored the children entirely, seemed to be completely intent on their business. Thank you for the hydrate, you hear. Some of them went into the apartment buildings. Most of them were headed in the same direction as the children. As these people came to the main street from side streets, they would swing around corners with an odd, automatic stride, as though they were so deep in their own problems and the route was so familiar that they didn't have to pay any attention to where they were going. After a while, the apartment buildings gave way to what must have been office buildings, great stern structures with enormous entrances. Men and women with briefcases poured in and out. Charles Wallace went up to one of the women, saying politely, "Excuse me, but could you please tell me?" But she hardly glanced at him as she continued on her way. Look, Meg pointed. Ahead of them, across the square, was the largest building they had ever seen, higher than the Empire State Building and almost as long as it was high. This must be it, Charles Wallace said. Their central intelligence or whatever it is. Let's go on. But if Father's in some kind of trouble with this planet, isn't this exactly where we shouldn't go? Well, how do you propose finding him? Charles Wallace demanded. I certainly wouldn't ask there. I didn't say anything about asking, but we aren't going to have the faintest idea where or how to begin to look for him until we find out something more about this place. I have a hunch that that's the place to start. If you have a better idea, Meg, why of course just say so. Oh, get down off your high horse, Meg said crossly. Let's go to your old Central Intelligence, get it over with. I think we ought to have passports or something, Calvin suggested. There's much more than leaving America. There's much more than leaving America to go to Europe, and that boy and the woman both seemed to care so much about things having a proper order. We certainly haven't gotten any papers in proper order. If we needed passports or papers, Mrs. Whatsit would have told us so, Charles Wallace said. Calvin put his hands on his hips and looked at Charles Wallace. Now look here, old sport. I love those 3 old girls just as much as you do, but I'm not sure they know everything. They know a lot more than we do, granted, but you know Mrs. Whatsit talked about having been a star, and I wouldn't think that being a star would give her much practice in knowing about people. When she tried to be a person, she came pretty close to goofing it up. There's never anybody on land or sea like Mrs. Whatsit the way she got herself up. She was just having fun, Charles said. If she wanted to look like you or Meg, I'm sure she could have. Calvin shook his head. I'm not so sure. And these people seem to be people, if you know what I mean. They aren't like us. I grant you, there's something very offbeat about them, but they're a lot more like ordinary people than the ones on Uriel. Do you suppose they're robots? Meg suggested. Charles Wallace shook his head. No, the boy who dropped the ball wasn't any robot. I don't think the rest of them are either. Let me listen for a minute. They stood very still, side by side, in the shadow of one of the big office buildings. 6 large doors kept swinging open, shut, as people went in and out, looking straight ahead. Looking straight ahead, paying no attention to the children whatsoever. Charles wore his listening, probing look. They're not robots, he said, suddenly and definitely. I'm not sure what they are, but they're not robots. I can feel minds in there. I just can't get at them at all. But I can feel them sort of pulsing. Let me try a minute more. The 3 of them stood there very quietly. The doors kept opening and shutting, and the stiff people hurried in and out, walking jerkily like figures in an odd silent movie. Then abruptly, the stream of movement thinned. There were only a few people, and these moved more rapidly as if the film had been sped up. One white-faced man in a dark suit looked directly at the children and said, "Oh dear, I shall be late," and flickered into the building. He's like the White Rabbit. Meg giggles nervously. I'm scared, Charles said. I can't reach them at all. I'm completely shut out. We have to find Father. Meg started again. Meg. Charles Wallace's eyes were wide and frightened. I'm not sure I'll even know Father. It's been so long, and I was only a baby. Meg's reassurance came quickly. You'll know him. Of course you'll know him. The way you'd know me even without looking, because I'm always there for you. You can always reach in. Yes, Charles punched one small fist into an open palm. With a gesture of great decision. Let's go to Central Intelligence. Calvin reached out and caught both Charles and Meg by the arm. You remember when we just met, you asked me why I was there? And I told you it was because I had a compulsion, a feeling I just had to come to that particular place at that particular moment? Yes, sure. Got another feeling. Not the same kind, a different one. A feeling that if we go into that building, we're going to be in terrible danger. Alright, that is the end of Chapter 6.